I was 17 when my little sister destroyed my life with 4 words that still echo in my nightmares. We were sitting around our dining table on a Tuesday evening in March, the smell of my mom's meatloaf filling our modest ranch house in suburban Indiana. My stepfather, Craig, was discussing his new promotion at the insurance company. My mother, Linda, was fussing over 3-year-old Tommy's eating habits. And my 15-year-old sister, Melody, was picking at her green beans with typical teenage disdain. Then, without warning, Melody looked directly at me and said, "Dakota touched Tommy inappropriately." The fork slipped from my hand, clattering against my plate as silence consumed our home. The next few hours unfolded like a horrific dream I couldn't wake up from. Craig immediately grabbed his cell phone and dialed 911 while my mother scooped Tommy into her arms, backing away from me as if I were a venomous snake ready to strike. I sat frozen at that dinner table, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Melody's accusation hung in the air, but like toxic smoke poisoning everything it touched. "This is Craig Henderson at 427 Maple Street." My stepfather spoke into the phone with surprising calmness. "We need police and child protective services here immediately. We have a situation involving inappropriate contact with a minor child." His eyes never left my face as he spoke cold and calculating in a way that made my stomach churn with dread. "Craig, there's been some mistake." I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible above the pounding of my heart. "I would never hurt Tommy. I love him. You know that." My mother refused to look at me, clutching Tommy so tightly that he began to whimper and squirm in her embrace. "How could you do this to our family?" she said, her voice breaking with what sounded like genuine anguish. "How could you betray our trust like this?" Within 20 minutes, our quiet neighborhood was transformed into a crime scene. Red and blue lights flashed through our living room windows as 2 police cruisers and an unmarked sedan pulled into our driveway. I watched through the curtains as Mrs. Patterson from next door peered out her front door, her hand covering her mouth in shock. The entire street would be talking about this within the hour. Officer Reynolds, a heavy-set man with graying temples, entered our home with the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with family crises. He spoke first with Craig and my mother in hushed tones, while I remained seated at the kitchen table, my hands trembling uncontrollably. Melody sat across from me, her eyes downcast, refusing to meet my gaze. "Melody, sweetheart," Officer Reynolds said gently, kneeling beside my sister's chair. "Can you tell me exactly what you saw Dakota do to Tommy? I need you to be very specific and truthful." What happened next shattered whatever hope I had left for a reasonable explanation. Melody began recounting detailed allegations that were so specific and disturbing that I felt physically ill listening to her words. She described incidents that supposedly occurred over the past several months, always when she claimed Craig and my mother were out running errands or working late. Her testimony was delivered with a composure that seemed far too mature for a 15-year-old girl. "I've been keeping a diary," Melody said, producing a purple notebook from her backpack. "I wrote down everything I witnessed because I knew adults wouldn't believe me without proof. Dakota always told me that nobody would take my word over hers because she's the good student and I'm just the troublemaker." The notebook contained pages of entries dating back 3 months each one, documenting supposed incidents in Melody's neat handwriting. The level of detail was staggering, describing times and locations with precision that would make any prosecutor salivate. As Officer Reynolds read through the entries, his expression grew increasingly grim. "Dakota Henderson, you're under arrest," he said, standing and reaching for the handcuffs attached to his belt. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The metal cuffs felt impossibly cold against my wrists as he read me my rights. My mother was sobbing openly now, holding Tommy against her chest, while Craig's arm wrapped protectively around both of them. The image burned itself into my memory, my own family united against me, treating me like a predator who had infiltrated their home. "Mom, please," I begged as Officer Reynolds guided me toward the front door. "You raised me. You know I'm not capable of this. Something's wrong here. This isn't real." But Linda Henderson, the woman who had kissed my scraped knees and celebrated my honor roll achievements, looked at me with pure disgust. "I don't know you at all," she said, her voice hollow with disappointment. I thought I did, but I was clearly wrong about everything. The walk to the police car felt like a death march. Mrs. Patterson and several other neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk watching as I was loaded into the back seat like a common criminal. The shame was overwhelming, a crushing weight that made it difficult to breathe. As we drove away from the only home I had ever known, I caught a glimpse of Melody standing in our living room window. For just a moment, our eyes met, and I could have sworn I saw regret flicker across her features. The county juvenile detention facility was a stark concrete building that looked more like a prison than a place for children. The intake process was humiliating beyond description. They confiscated my clothes, searched every inch of my body, and assigned me a bright orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on my small frame. The other detainees were hardened kids who had committed real crimes: theft, assault, drug possession. I was surrounded by genuine criminals while maintaining my innocence about something I would never even consider doing. My first night in detention was the longest of my life. The narrow cot felt like sleeping on cardboard, and the constant noise from other cells made rest impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed Melody's accusations and tried to understand what had motivated her to destroy our family so completely. We had our typical sibling disagreements, but nothing that would warrant such devastating revenge. The most heartbreaking part was realizing that my parents had made no attempt to post my bail or even visit me. Craig and my mother had apparently accepted Melody's version of events without question, abandoning me completely when I needed their support most. The betrayal cut deeper than the false accusations themselves. 3 days later, I met my court-appointed attorney for the first time. Margaret Walsh was an overworked public defender in her 50s who carried herself with the weary resignation of someone who had seen too many broken families. She reviewed my case file with clinical detachment, occasionally shaking her head at particular details. Dakota, I have to be honest with you," she said, closing the folder and leaning back in her plastic chair. "Your sister's testimony is extremely detailed and consistent. She's provided specific dates, times, and locations that will be difficult to challenge in court. The diary entries alone present a significant challenge for your defense." "But it's all lies," I protested, my voice cracking with desperation. "I don't know why she's saying these things, but none of it happened. You have to believe me." Margaret studied my face carefully, her expression softening slightly. "What troubles me most about this case is how prepared your sister seems to be. Most children who witness abuse struggle to articulate their experiences clearly. Melody's testimony reads like she was coached by someone with extensive knowledge of how these cases are prosecuted." Her observation hit me like a physical blow. Someone had indeed prepared Melody for this moment, teaching her exactly what to say and how to say it. But who would go to such lengths to frame me for such a horrible crime, and more importantly, why the Brennan family lived in a cramped 2-story house on the outskirts of town where the smell of cigarette smoke and overcooked food created a permanent haze that clung to everything. Frank Brennan was a retired factory worker with calloused hands and a perpetual scowl while his wife, Sandra, chain-smoked menthol cigarettes and watched daytime television with religious devotion. They had been fostering troubled teenagers for over a decade, treating it more like a business transaction than an act of compassion. From the moment I walked through their front door carrying my meager possessions in a donated garbage bag, the Brennans made it clear that I was not welcome in their home. They knew about the charges against me, and their disgust was palpable in every interaction we shared. "You'll sleep in the basement," Sandra announced without looking away from her soap opera. There's a cot down there and a dresser for your things. Meals are at 6, 12, and 6. Miss one and you go hungry until the next. House rules are posted on the refrigerator. Break them and you'll answer to Frank. The basement was a damp, windowless space with concrete walls that wept moisture during Indiana's humid summers. The single bare bulb cast harsh shadows that made the room feel more like a cell than living quarters. My cot was positioned next to the water heater, which gurgled and hissed throughout the night like some mechanical beast guarding my nightmares. School became another form of torture altogether. Word of my arrest had spread through the gossip networks with lightning speed, and I found myself completely isolated within days of enrolling at Jefferson High School. Former friends crossed the street to avoid me. Teachers watched my every movement with suspicious eyes, and whispered conversations stopped abruptly whenever I entered a room. "There's the baby toucher," I heard someone say as I walked through the cafeteria during my first week. The comment was followed by cruel laughter that echoed off the walls like gunshots. I ate my lunch alone at a corner table, trying to ignore the stares and pointed fingers that followed my every move. My grades, which had always been a source of pride, plummeted as depression and anxiety consumed my ability to concentrate. The honors classes I had once excelled in became insurmountable challenges when my mind was constantly occupied with questions about my shattered family and uncertain future. Sleep deprivation from the noisy basement made focusing even more difficult. Mrs. Rodriguez, my chemistry teacher, was the only faculty member who treated me with basic human dignity. She never mentioned my legal troubles directly, but she offered quiet encouragement when my test scores reflected my inner turmoil. "Dakota, I know you're going through a difficult time," she said after class one afternoon. "If you ever need someone to talk to, my door is always open. Sometimes having a neutral person to listen can make all the difference." Her kindness was a rare bright spot in those dark months, but even she couldn't shield me from the constant reminder that everyone in my life had labeled me a monster. The loneliness was suffocating, made worse by the knowledge that my own family had orchestrated my exile from everything I had ever known. Frank Brennan's hostility escalated as weeks passed. He seemed to take personal offense to my presence in his home, treating me like a ticking time bomb that might explode at any moment. His paranoia manifested in increasingly bizarre restrictions on my movements and activities. "You're not allowed to use the upstairs bathroom when Sandra's granddaughters visit," he declared during my second month. "Matter of fact, you should probably stay in the basement entirely when children are in this house. We don't need any incidents under our roof." The isolation became so complete that I began talking to myself just to hear a human voice show some kindness. I would lie on that uncomfortable cot and replay memories of better times with my family, trying to understand what had gone so terribly wrong. The happy moments we had shared felt like they belonged to someone else's life-distant dreams that couldn't possibly be connected to my current nightmare. 3 months into my stay with the Brennans, I made a discovery that changed everything. I had been assigned to take out the trash after dinner when I noticed Frank speaking quietly on his cell phone near the garage. Something about his secretive tone made me pause behind the garden shed close enough to overhear his conversation. "Yes, she's still maintaining her innocence," Frank was saying to whoever was on the other end. "No signs of breaking down or admitting guilt. The kid seems genuinely confused about the whole thing, which is exactly what you told me to watch for." My blood turned to ice as the implications of his words sank in. Frank Brennan was reporting on my emotional state and daily activities to someone who had specifically instructed him to monitor my reactions to the accusations. This wasn't random foster placement. It was coordinated surveillance designed to gather intelligence about my psychological response to the charges. "She cries herself to sleep most nights," Frank continued. "Keeps saying she doesn't understand why her sister would lie about her. Either this kid is the most talented actor I've ever seen, or something about this whole case stinks to high heaven." The person on the other end of the conversation said something that made Frank chuckle darkly. Yeah, well, that's above my pay grade. I just report what I see, and what I see is a scared teenager who doesn't act like someone guilty of what she's accused of. I crept back to the house with my mind racing Frank's words, confirming my worst suspicions. Someone had orchestrated not just the false accusations, but also my placement with foster parents who had been specifically chosen to spy on me. The level of planning and coordination required for such an operation suggested that powerful people were invested in destroying my life for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom. That night, lying in the damp basement while the water heater gurgled its mechanical lullaby, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my case. If someone was watching my every move and reporting back to unknown handlers, then I would use that surveillance to my advantage. I would start documenting everything I observed, every conversation I overheard, and every suspicious behavior pattern I noticed. The truth was out there somewhere, buried beneath layers of lies and manipulation. Finding it would require patience, careful observation, and the kind of strategic thinking that my accusers clearly didn't expect from a 17-year-old girl. They had underestimated my intelligence and determination mistakes that would eventually lead to their downfall. But first, I needed to survive long enough to gather the evidence that would expose the conspiracy against me. In the meantime, Frank Brennan's phone calls had provided the first crack in the wall of lies surrounding my case. Someone was very interested in my psychological state and reactions, which meant they were worried about something. That fear would be their weakness, and I intended to exploit it with everything I had. The Marion County Courthouse became my second home over the following 6 months, an imposing granite building where justice moved with the speed of molasses and the efficiency of a broken clock. Margaret Walsh did her best with an impossible caseload, but her efforts felt perfunctory compared to the prosecution's relentless assault on my character and credibility. District Attorney Robert Chen had built his career on high-profile cases involving crimes against children, and he approached my prosecution with the fervor of a man running for higher office. His opening statements painted me as a master manipulator who had fooled everyone around me while systematically abusing my innocent baby brother. The jury listened with rapt attention as he described a pattern of behavior that bore no resemblance to my actual life. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Chen declared during one particularly brutal hearing, we are dealing with a young woman who has perfected the art of deception. She maintained honor roll grades while secretly traumatizing a helpless child. She volunteered at church functions while plotting her next opportunity to violate the sacred trust between siblings. This case represents every parent's worst nightmare evil, hiding behind a mask of innocence. The psychological evaluations were perhaps the most degrading aspect of the entire process. Dr. Harrison Stokes, a child psychologist with the bedside manner of a mortician, subjected me to hours of invasive questioning designed to uncover signs of deviant behavior or repressed memories. His office smelled like antiseptic and disappointment, with motivational posters that seemed to mock anyone unfortunate enough to be seated across from his imposing desk. Dakota, I want you to think very carefully about your relationship with Tommy, Dr. Stokes said during our third session, his pen hovering over a yellow legal pad. Sometimes people block out traumatic experiences as a defense mechanism. It's possible that you engaged in inappropriate behavior without fully understanding or remembering your actions. I remember everything about my interactions with Tommy, I replied firmly. I changed his diapers, fed him bottles, read him bedtime stories, and played with his toy trucks. Every moment I spent with him was innocent and loving. I don't have repressed memories because there's nothing to repress. Dr. Stokes made lengthy notes about what he called my defensive posturing and inability to access difficult emotions. His reports characterized my consistent denials as evidence of psychological dysfunction rather than simple honesty. In his professional opinion, my unwavering claims of innocence actually supported the prosecution's case by demonstrating my capacity for sustained deception. The social workers assigned to my case treated me with barely concealed contempt, approaching every interview with the assumption that I was guilty and simply needed to be broken down until I confessed. Their questions were designed to trap me in contradictions or force admissions of guilt through psychological manipulation. "We know this has been difficult for you," said Ms. Jennifer Hawkins during one particularly aggressive interrogation. "Carrying around this secret must be exhausting. Don't you think it would feel better to tell the truth and start the healing process? Your family wants to forgive you, but first you need to take responsibility for your actions." "There's nothing to take responsibility for." I insisted, my voice hoarse from hours of repetitive questioning. "I never hurt Tommy. I would rather die than harm him. How many times do I have to tell you people the same thing?" Ms. Hawkins exchanged meaningful glances with her colleagues, their expressions suggesting that my emotional outburst merely confirmed their preconceived notions about my guilt. They seemed genuinely puzzled by my refusal to confess, as if they had never encountered a defendant who maintained innocence in the face of overwhelming pressure. 6 months into the legal proceedings, during what should have been a routine hearing to discuss plea arrangements, Robert Chen dropped a bombshell that left me reeling with shock and disbelief. He stood before Judge Patricia Williams with the confidence of a man holding a royal flush ready to play his most devastating card. "Oh, Your Honor, the prosecution has uncovered additional evidence that significantly expands the scope of this case," Chen announced with theatrical gravity. "The victim's sister, Melody Henderson, has now provided testimony regarding previous incidents of inappropriate behavior dating back approximately 2 years. These new allegations paint a picture of systematic abuse that was far more extensive than initially believed." Margaret Walsh shot to her feet, her face flushed with indignation. "Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution cannot introduce new charges at this stage of proceedings without proper notice and discovery. This is highly irregular and prejudicial to my client's defense." Judge Williams, a stern woman in her 60s who had presided over family court for over 20 years, studied the documents Chen had submitted with growing concern. "Mr. Chen, these are indeed serious allegations. However, Ms. Walsh raises valid procedural objections. Why are we only hearing about these incidents now?" "Your Honor, the additional testimony emerged during ongoing therapeutic sessions with the witness," Chen explained smoothly. "As Melody Henderson has worked with trained counselors to process her trauma, she has recovered memories of earlier incidents that she had previously suppressed. These recovered memories provide crucial context for understanding the defendant's pattern of predatory behavior." The phrase "recovered memories" sent chills down my spine. I had read about cases where therapeutic suggestion had led to false memories of abuse destroying families and sending innocent people to prison. The idea that Melody was now claiming to remember incidents from years past, incidents that I knew had never occurred, suggested that her original accusations were just the beginning of a much larger campaign of destruction. The new allegations include detailed descriptions of inappropriate touching that allegedly occurred when Dakota Henderson was 15 and 16 years old. Chen continued, his voice rising with a prosecutorial passion. "The defendant reportedly threatened her sister with physical violence if she revealed the abuse, creating a climate of fear that silenced the victim for years." I felt the courtroom spinning around me as Chen outlined allegations that grew more elaborate and disturbing with each passing sentence. According to this new version of events, I had been systematically abusing Tommy since he was barely walking while simultaneously terrorizing Melody into silence through threats and intimidation. The story was so far removed from reality that it felt like listening to someone describe events from an alternate universe. Margaret Walsh was furiously scribbling notes, her legal pad filling with questions and objections that would likely prove futile against Chen's carefully orchestrated presentation. She looked as stunned as I felt, clearly unprepared for this dramatic escalation in the charges against me. Furthermore, Chen said, delivering his final blow with perfect timing, we have reason to believe that the defendant's inappropriate behavior may have extended beyond her immediate family. We are currently investigating potential connections to other victims who may have been too frightened or ashamed to come forward. The implication was clear. I was being painted as a serial predator whose crimes extended far beyond anything Melody had originally described. This wasn't just about false accusations anymore. It was about transforming me into a monster whose very existence threatened every child in our community. As I sat in that courtroom, listening to my life being systematically destroyed by lies wrapped in legal language, one thought dominated my consciousness. Melody's new allegations were too detailed, too psychologically sophisticated, and too perfectly timed to be genuine recovered memories. Someone with extensive knowledge of how these cases were prosecuted had been coaching her, teaching her exactly what to say and when to say it. The question that haunted me as court adjourned that day was simple but terrifying. Who had the power and motivation to orchestrate such an elaborate frame-up, and what did they hope to accomplish by destroying an innocent teenager's life? The answer to that question would determine whether I spent the next decade in prison or found a way to expose the truth before it was too late. Jessica Martinez had been working in child protective services for 15 years, long enough to develop an instinct for distinguishing between genuine abuse cases and something more complicated. She was assigned to my case during my 8th month in the system, replacing the previous caseworker who had transferred to another county. Unlike her predecessor, Jessica approached our first meeting with curiosity rather than condemnation. "I've been reviewing your file, Dakota," she said, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair across from me in the sterile conference room at the juvenile center. "There are some inconsistencies here that I'd like to discuss with you. I'm not here to judge you or pressure you into any particular response. I just want to understand what really happened in your family." Jessica was a petite woman in her early 40s with graying hair and laugh lines that suggested she still found joy in her challenging profession despite years of exposure to humanity's darkest impulses. Her gentle demeanor was a stark contrast to the aggressive interrogation tactics I had endured from other social workers. "I've told the same story to everyone who's asked," I replied wearily. "I never touched Tommy inappropriately. I never threatened Melody. I don't know why she's saying these things, but none of it is true. I'm starting to wonder if anyone even cares about the truth anymore." Jessica opened her laptop and pulled up digital copies of the case files, her expression thoughtful as she scrolled through pages of reports and testimony. "What interests me most are the subtle changes in your sister's statements between interviews. Small details that have shifted over time, descriptions that have become more elaborate and specific as months have passed." She turned the screen so I could see highlighted sections of Melody's various testimonies. The differences were subtle but unmistakable when viewed side by side. Initial statements that had been vague and emotional had evolved into precise clinical descriptions that read like excerpts from a psychology textbook. In her first statement, Melody said she saw something that didn't look right, Jessica explained, pointing to the highlighted text. By her 4th interview, that same incident had become a detailed description of specific acts that would be nearly impossible for a 15-year-old to fabricate without extensive coaching or exposure to explicit material. The revelation that someone had been systematically grooming Melody's testimony hit me like a physical blow. It confirmed what I had suspected, but couldn't prove that my sister was as much a victim in this situation as I was manipulated by someone with the knowledge and authority to orchestrate such an elaborate deception. There's something else that troubles me. Jessica continued, closing the laptop and leaning forward with genuine concern. I've been working with child abuse victims for over a decade, and there are certain developmental patterns that are almost universal. Children who witness or experience trauma typically struggle to articulate their experiences clearly, especially in formal interview settings. Melody's testimony demonstrates a level of psychological sophistication that's extremely unusual for someone her age. She paused to gather her thoughts before delivering the observation that would change everything. Dakota, I need to tell you something that goes beyond my usual scope of responsibilities. I was also assigned to conduct a wellness check on Tommy as part of the ongoing investigation into your case. What I discovered during that evaluation has raised some very serious questions about what's actually happening in your family's household. My heart began racing as Jessica's words sank in. If she had been evaluating Tommy's current condition, that meant she had access to medical records and behavioral assessments that could provide crucial evidence about when any abuse might have actually occurred. Tommy is showing signs of trauma that are consistent with ongoing abuse, Jessica said quietly, her voice heavy with the weight of professional expertise. But the timeline doesn't match the allegations against you. The behavioral indicators and physical evidence suggest that abuse has been continuing during the months since you were removed from the home. Someone has been hurting that little boy, and it wasn't you. The room seemed to tilt as the implications of her revelation crashed over me like a tsunami. If Tommy was still being abused after my removal, then I had been telling the truth all along. More importantly, it meant that the real perpetrator was still in the house, still harming my baby brother, while I sat in detention for crimes I didn't commit. Why hasn't anyone else noticed this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. How is it possible that I'm the only one being investigated when Tommy is clearly still in danger? Jessica's expression darkened with what looked like professional frustration mixed with personal anger. That's exactly what I've been wondering. I've submitted 3 separate reports documenting concerns about Tommy's ongoing welfare, but my supervisors keep redirecting the investigation back to your case. Someone with significant influence wants this focused on you specifically, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. She leaned back in her chair, studying my face carefully as she prepared to share information that would fundamentally alter my understanding of the conspiracy against me. Dakota, I've been doing this job long enough to recognize when cases are being manipulated from above. The pressure to prosecute you has been intense and consistent from day one, with very little interest in exploring alternative theories or suspects. What are you saying? I asked, though I was beginning to understand the terrifying scope of what she was revealing. I'm saying that someone with connections in law enforcement, child services, or the prosecutor's office has been actively steering this investigation away from the real perpetrator and toward you, Jessica replied bluntly. The question is why? What would motivate someone to frame an innocent teenager for such horrible crimes? As we sat in that sterile conference room surrounded by case files and legal documents that painted me as a monster, Jessica's words provided the first glimmer of hope I had experienced in months. For the first time since Melody's initial accusation, I was speaking with someone who questioned the official narrative and was willing to investigate inconsistencies in the evidence. But Jessica's revelations also filled me with a new kind of terror. If someone powerful enough to influence multiple agencies was orchestrating my persecution, then the danger extended far beyond my personal freedom. Tommy was still suffering while the real abuser remained protected by a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the local justice system. What can we do? I asked, desperate for any action that might protect my baby brother and expose the truth. Jessica gathered her files and closed her laptop with the determination of someone who had made a difficult decision. We're going to follow the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of who doesn't want us looking in that direction. But Dakota, you need to understand something. If I'm right about this conspiracy, then we're not just fighting false accusations anymore. We're challenging people with the power to destroy careers and manipulate the legal system itself. She stood to leave, then paused at the door with one final observation that would haunt my dreams for weeks to come. Tommy isn't the only victim here. Melody has been manipulated and coached by someone who understands exactly how to exploit a teenage girl's vulnerabilities. When this all comes out, and it will come out, we're going to discover that your entire family has been systematically destroyed by someone who saw you as an obstacle to something much bigger than personal revenge. As Jessica left me alone in that conference room, her words echoing in the sterile air, I realized that my fight for vindication had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous than I had ever imagined. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of lies and institutional corruption, but uncovering it would require courage, cunning, and allies willing to risk everything for justice. The real battle was just beginning. Working with Jessica required careful coordination and absolute secrecy. She had made it clear that our unofficial investigation could cost her career if discovered by her supervisors, who seemed determined to maintain focus on my prosecution regardless of contradictory evidence. We developed a system of communication through my court-appointed attorney, using attorney-client privilege to shield our conversations from outside scrutiny. During our second clandestine meeting, Jessica brought copies of Tommy's medical records that painted a disturbing picture of ongoing trauma. The documentation showed a pattern of suspicious injuries and behavioral regression that had actually intensified since my removal from the household, providing concrete evidence that I couldn't possibly be responsible for his suffering. "Look at these dates," Jessica said, spreading the medical files across the small table in the attorney consultation room. "Emergency room visit for a suspicious bruise on his upper arm 2 weeks after you were arrested. Another visit for what the family claimed was a playground accident, but the injury pattern doesn't match their explanation. Most telling of all, Tommy's speech development has actually regressed since you've been gone." The medical evidence was damning in its implications. According to the records, Tommy had been making normal developmental progress until approximately 6 months before my arrest, when he began showing signs of anxiety, sleep disturbances, and regression in toilet training. The timeline suggested that abuse had begun long before Melody's accusations, during a period when I could provide alibis for my whereabouts. "There's something else," Jessica continued, lowering her voice despite the privacy of our meeting room. "I did some research into Melody's volunteer work at the Crisis Center, the place where she supposedly learned about child abuse indicators. The director there, Susan Walsh, confirmed that Melody had access to detailed case files and educational materials about recognizing signs of sexual abuse. This revelation provided crucial insight into how Melody had acquired the sophisticated knowledge reflected in her testimony. She hadn't developed her understanding of abuse patterns through personal experience. She had studied them like a textbook subject, learning exactly what details would be most convincing to investigators and prosecutors. "But here's what's really interesting," Jessica said, pulling out another set of documents. Susan Walsh also mentioned that Melody's volunteer hours were arranged by her stepfather, Craig Henderson. He personally drove her to orientation sessions and stayed in regular contact with the center's staff about her training progress. The pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to fit together in a way that made horrible sense. Craig hadn't just failed to protect his family from a supposed predator. He had actively prepared Melody to deliver convincing testimony about abuse patterns she had never actually witnessed. The level of planning and manipulation required for such a scheme suggested a level of cunning that was truly terrifying. Jessica's next revelation struck me like lightning. I managed to obtain copies of Melody's diary entries, the ones she submitted as evidence against you, Dakota. I've worked with genuine child abuse victims for 15 years, and these entries don't read like authentic trauma documentation. They read like someone was following a template. She showed me photocopies of selected pages from Melody's purple notebook, highlighting specific phrases and descriptions that appeared repeatedly throughout her alleged documentation of my crimes. The language was clinical and detached, lacking the emotional chaos that typically characterize genuine trauma narratives. Real victims don't document their experiences with this level of systematic detail, Jessica explained. They write in fragments with gaps in memory and inconsistent emotional responses. These entries read like someone was checking items off a list, making sure to include all the elements that would be most damaging in court. The systematic nature of Melody's documentation suggested extensive coaching by someone with professional knowledge of how child abuse cases were investigated and prosecuted. Every entry contained specific details that would be difficult to challenge in court, presented in language that would resonate with judges and juries conditioned to believe children's testimony without question. During my 3rd month of secret collaboration with Jessica, we made a breakthrough that fundamentally changed our understanding of the conspiracy against me. While reviewing Craig's background for potential red flags, Jessica discovered that his previous employment had been terminated under circumstances that raised serious questions about his character and judgment. Craig Henderson was fired from his previous job at Midwest Financial Services, Jessica revealed during our most crucial meeting. The termination was officially listed as downsizing, but I managed to speak with someone who worked there at the time. According to my source, Craig was actually dismissed due to inappropriate behavior toward female employees and concerns about his access to client files containing personal information about their children. This information provided the missing motive for Craig's elaborate frame-up scheme. If his employment history included credible accusations of inappropriate behavior, then Melody's false allegations against me served a dual purpose. They deflected attention from his own criminal activities while simultaneously destroying the credibility of anyone who might expose his past. "There's more," Jessica continued, her expression growing increasingly grim. "I contacted his previous employer using official channels, claiming routine background verification for his current position. They were surprisingly forthcoming about their concerns regarding his termination. Apparently, there were multiple complaints from female colleagues about unwanted advances and inappropriate comments about their families." The pattern of behavior Jessica described painted a picture of a man who used his professional position to gather intelligence about potential victims while maintaining a facade of respectability. His marriage to my mother had provided him with perfect access to Tommy while placing him in a position of authority over our entire family. "Jessica, there's something I need to tell you about my foster placement," I said, deciding to share my discovery about Frank Brennan's surveillance activities. My foster father has been reporting on my emotional state and daily activities to someone. I overheard him describing my reactions to the accusations in detail as if he was following specific instructions about what to monitor. Jessica's expression shifted from concern to alarm as I recounted Frank's secret phone conversations and his clinical observations about my psychological state. The revelation that my foster placement had been specifically chosen for surveillance purposes confirmed that the conspiracy against me reached deep into the child welfare system itself. This changes everything," Jessica said, beginning to pace around the small consultation room. "If they've been monitoring your responses and reactions, it means someone was worried about your potential to expose their lies. They needed to ensure you remained isolated and discredited while they solidified their case against you." She stopped pacing and fixed me with an intense stare that conveyed both determination and fear. "Dakota, what we've uncovered here goes far beyond simple false accusations. This is a coordinated campaign involving multiple agencies and individuals all working together to destroy an innocent person's life. The question we need to answer is, who has the power and connections necessary to orchestrate something this elaborate? The final piece of evidence Jessica uncovered during our collaborative investigation provided the smoking gun we needed to understand Craig's motivation for framing me. While researching his current employment at the insurance company, she discovered that his recent promotion had come with a significant increase in responsibilities and access to sensitive financial information. Craig's new position requires extensive background checks and security clearances, Jessica explained. Any hint of impropriety in his past would have disqualified him from consideration. Melody's accusations against you came just days before his final security review was scheduled to be completed. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Craig had orchestrated the entire conspiracy against me as a preemptive strike designed to ensure that any future allegations about his behavior would be dismissed as retaliatory lies from a convicted sex offender's family. By destroying my credibility and removing me from the household, he had eliminated the most likely person to recognize and report his abuse of Tommy. We have enough evidence to approach the authorities, Jessica said, organizing our collected documentation into a comprehensive file. Medical records proving ongoing abuse after your removal, employment history showing Craig's pattern of inappropriate behavior, and testimony from multiple sources confirming that Melody's accusations were coached and fabricated. But even as we prepared to present our findings, both Jessica and I understood that exposing the truth would require more than just evidence. We were challenging a conspiracy that included people with influence in law enforcement, child services, and the prosecutor's office. The same people who had orchestrated my persecution would be responsible for investigating our allegations against Craig. Dakota, I want you to understand something before we take this next step, Jessica said, her voice heavy with the weight of professional experience. When we reveal what we've discovered, there will be powerful people who have invested too much in your prosecution to simply admit they were wrong. They'll fight to suppress this evidence and discredit our investigation. I looked at the files spread across our table, representing months of careful investigation and documentation that proved my innocence beyond any reasonable doubt. The evidence was overwhelming, but I had learned enough about the corruption surrounding my case to understand that truth and justice didn't always align in the real world. What choice do we have? I asked, thinking about Tommy's continued suffering while Craig remained free to abuse him. Even if they try to suppress this evidence, we can't let him keep hurting my brother. We have to try. Jessica nodded grimly, gathering the files that would either vindicate me or result in both of us facing professional and personal retaliation from people who preferred their lies to remain hidden. Then let's expose these bastards and get Tommy the protection he deserves. But Dakota, once we start this process, there's no going back. Are you ready for that? I thought about my baby brother, barely 4 years old and suffering abuse, while the system designed to protect him pursued his innocent sister instead. I thought about Melody, manipulated and coached into becoming an unwitting accomplice in Craig's crimes. I thought about my mother, blinded by love and financial dependence to the monster she had married. I've been ready since the night they arrested me, I replied, meeting Jessica's determined gaze with my own. Let's bring this son of a bitch down. The breakthrough in our investigation came from an unexpected source, Craig's own arrogance and carelessness. Jessica had been quietly monitoring Tommy's welfare through legitimate channels when she discovered that Craig had been taking the child to medical appointments without my mother's knowledge, claiming urgent care needs that didn't match the documented injuries. I cross-referenced the appointment dates with your mother's work schedule, Jessica explained during our most critical meeting yet. Linda was always at her job during these visits, which means Craig was alone with Tommy when these suspicious injuries were supposedly occurring. He's been systematically abusing that child while simultaneously building a paper trail to support alternative explanations. The medical records painted a horrifying picture of calculated abuse disguised as accidents and childhood mishaps. bruises on Tommy's upper arms that Craig attributed to playground falls, marks around his wrists that were explained as reactions to new soap and behavioral regression that was blamed on the trauma of my supposed crimes. Every injury had a prepared explanation, every symptom a convenient excuse that deflected suspicion from the real perpetrator. Jessica's most damning discovery came through her connections in the medical community. Dr. Patricia Evans, a pediatrician who had examined Tommy during one of Craig's solo visits, had documented concerns that went far beyond the official reports filed with Child Protective Services. Dr. Evans was troubled by Tommy's behavior during the examination. Jessica revealed showing me copies of the doctor's personal notes that had never been submitted as official documentation. She described him as unusually fearful of adult male authority figures and noted that he became agitated when she asked routine questions about how his injuries occurred. The pediatrician's observations included disturbing details about Tommy's reactions to basic medical procedures. He had exhibited extreme anxiety when asked to remove his clothing for examination, repeatedly asking if Daddy Craig would be angry about the appointment and displaying sexualized behavior that was completely inappropriate for a child his age. But here's the most significant finding. Jessica continued, her voice heavy with professional anger. Dr. Evans documented physical evidence that strongly suggested sexual abuse, but her report was buried in Craig's insurance company's medical files rather than being forwarded to Child Protective Services. Someone with access to those records made sure her concerns never reached the proper authorities. The conspiracy was becoming clearer with each piece of evidence we uncovered. Craig's position at the insurance company provided him with the connections and influence necessary to suppress medical reports that might expose his crimes. His professional network included people with the authority to redirect investigations and ensure that inconvenient evidence disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. Jessica's investigation into Craig's background revealed even more disturbing information about his pattern of predatory behavior. Through contacts in law enforcement, she learned that Craig's name had appeared in 2 previous child abuse investigations in different states, but charges had never been filed due to lack of evidence and reluctant witnesses. "He's done this before," Jessica said, showing me police reports from Ohio and Illinois that documented suspicious circumstances surrounding Craig's interactions with children. In each case, he was romantically involved with single mothers who had young children. In each case, there were allegations that were ultimately dropped when the families suddenly moved away or refused to cooperate with investigators. The pattern suggested a sophisticated predator who specifically targeted vulnerable families where he could gain access to children while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. My mother, struggling financially as a single parent with 2 teenage daughters and a toddler, had been the perfect victim for his manipulative strategy. Craig's employment records show that he relocates frequently, always just before situations become too complicated for him to manage. Jessica continued. He spent the last 15 years moving from state to state, leaving behind a trail of broken families and traumatized children who were too young or too intimidated to provide effective testimony against him. The revelation that Craig was essentially a serial child abuser who had perfected his methods over decades made my situation both more comprehensible and more terrifying. I hadn't been randomly targeted by false accusations. I had been systematically eliminated by someone who saw me as a threat to his carefully constructed new hunting ground. Jessica's most crucial discovery came through her unofficial investigation into Craig's current activities. Using surveillance techniques that pushed the boundaries of legal investigation, she had documented a pattern of behavior that proved he was continuing to abuse Tommy while maintaining the facade of a concerned stepfather seeking justice for his family. I followed Craig to 3 different locations over the past month. Jessica admitted showing me photographs and time-stamped documentation of his activities. He's been taking Tommy to isolated locations during supposed bonding activities, always when your mother is working and can't verify their whereabouts. The photographs showed Craig and Tommy at remote parks, empty parking lots, and other secluded areas where potential witnesses would be unlikely. The timing of these outings corresponded perfectly with periods when Linda was scheduled for long shifts at her nursing job, providing Craig with extended unsupervised access to his victim. But the most damning evidence comes from Tommy himself, Jessica said, pulling out audio recordings that would change everything. I managed to record several conversations with him during my official welfare checks. Dakota, what that child describes is exactly what Melody accused you of doing, but he identifies Craig as the perpetrator. The audio recordings were heartbreaking beyond description. Tommy's small voice, speaking in the limited vocabulary of a 4-year-old, described games that Craig played with him when they were alone together. The details matched Melody's accusations against me with terrifying precision, proving that her testimony had been based on real events with a fabricated perpetrator. Craig has been coaching Tommy to keep their activities secret, Jessica explained as we listened to the devastating recordings. He's told the child that these interactions are normal family behavior that would only upset Mommy and Sissy if they found out. Tommy doesn't understand that he's being abused. He thinks he's protecting his family by keeping Craig's secrets. The sophisticated manipulation of a preschooler demonstrated a level of psychological control that explained how Craig had managed to abuse children for years without detection. He groomed his victims to become accomplices in their own exploitation, teaching them that silence was a form of love and that disclosure would destroy their families. Jessica's investigation had also uncovered the mechanism by which Craig had coached Melody's false testimony. Through her volunteer work at the crisis center, Melody had been exposed to detailed descriptions of child sexual abuse that Craig then used as templates for her accusations against me. Craig volunteered to drive Melody to her training sessions, but he was actually attending them himself, Jessica revealed. The crisis center's sign-in logs show that he participated in several educational workshops about recognizing signs of abuse and supporting child victims. He learned exactly what testimony would be most convincing to investigators. The depth of Craig's preparation was staggering in its calculated cruelty. He had spent months studying how child abuse cases were investigated and prosecuted, learning the precise language and specific details that would make Melody's false testimony unassailable. Every element of her accusations had been carefully crafted to exploit the assumptions and biases of law enforcement professionals. We have everything we need to expose him, Jessica said, organizing our evidence into a comprehensive file that documented Craig's crimes and the conspiracy to frame me. Medical records witnessed testimony, audio recordings, employment history, and documented patterns of predatory behavior spanning multiple states. But even as we prepared to present our findings, Jessica warned me about the challenges we would face in convincing authorities who had invested significant resources in prosecuting me. Craig's connections within the system meant that our revelations would be met with skepticism and resistance from people who preferred to maintain their original narrative rather than admit systemic failure. Dakota. When we reveal Craig's crimes, there will be people whose careers depend on your conviction, Jessica said soberly. They'll argue that our evidence was obtained improperly, that Tommy's statements were coached by us, that Melody's recantation was coerced. We need to be prepared for a fight that goes far beyond simply presenting the truth. I looked at the overwhelming evidence of Craig's guilt and the systematic conspiracy that had nearly destroyed my life, understanding that justice would require more than just facts and documentation. We were challenging institutional corruption that reached deep into the local law enforcement and child welfare systems. Then, let's make sure we have allies who can't be intimidated or bought. I replied, thinking about the network of professionals who had helped Jessica gather evidence against Craig. The truth is on our side, and there are still people in the system who care more about protecting children than protecting their careers. Jessica nodded with grim determination, gathering the files that would either vindicate me or result in our destruction by forces more powerful than either of us had initially comprehended. The real battle was about to begin, and the outcome would determine not just my future, but Tommy's safety and the exposure of a predator who had been protected by institutional corruption for far too long. The first sign that our investigation was being noticed by dangerous people came in the form of Jessica's sudden transfer to a different department within Child Protective Services. Her supervisor, Margaret Foster, called her into a closed-door meeting on a Tuesday morning and informed her that she would be reassigning to adoption services effective immediately with no explanation beyond administrative restructuring. "They're trying to remove me from your case," Jessica told me during what would be our final official meeting. "Margaret made it very clear that my overinvestment in your situation was causing problems for the department, and that I needed to focus on cases that were more straightforward in their resolution." The timing of Jessica's reassignment was suspicious enough to confirm our worst fears about the depth of corruption surrounding my case. Someone with sufficient influence had recognized that her investigation posed a threat to Craig's protection and had taken swift action to neutralize her involvement before she could present her evidence to higher authorities. "Did you tell anyone else about what we discovered?" I asked, terrified that our months of careful investigation might disappear along with Jessica's access to official channels. "I've documented everything and stored copies of our evidence in multiple secure locations," Jessica assured me. "But Dakota, I need you to understand something. Margaret didn't just transfer me. She specifically warned me against pursuing any further contact with your case or your family. She made it clear that continued involvement could result in termination and damage to my professional reputation." The threat against Jessica's career was clearly designed to silence her before she could present our findings to federal authorities or independent investigators who might be less susceptible to local political pressure. Craig's connections within the system were apparently extensive enough to reach into Child Protective Services Administration. 3 days after Jessica's forced transfer, Margaret Walsh received a surprise visit from District Attorney Robert Chen and 2 investigators from his office. They informed her that new evidence had emerged in my case that required immediate review, but they declined to specify the nature of this supposed evidence or explain why it hadn't been presented during regular discovery proceedings. "They spent over 2 hours going through your case files," Margaret told me during our next meeting. "They were particularly interested in any communications you might have had with your previous caseworker, Jessica Martinez. They seemed very concerned about whether she had been conducting unauthorized investigations or encouraging you to change your testimony." The aggressive interest in Jessica's activities confirmed that our investigation had indeed been detected by people with the power to interfere with legal proceedings. Chen's office was clearly trying to determine how much we had discovered about Craig's crimes and whether our evidence posed a threat to their prosecution of me. "Margaret, I need you to contact Jessica immediately," I urged, sensing that time was running short before more drastic action might be taken to suppress our findings. "She has evidence that proves my innocence and identifies the real perpetrator. If we don't act soon, they're going to find a way to make that evidence disappear." But Margaret's response revealed just how effectively the intimidation campaign was working. "Dakota, I have to advise you that pursuing unauthorized investigations or making unsubstantiated allegations against court officials could seriously damage your defense strategy. Sometimes it's better to focus on negotiating the best possible plea arrangement, rather than chasing conspiracy theories." The phrase "conspiracy theories" stung like a physical blow, revealing that even my own attorney was being influenced. by the narrative that painted me as a delusional teenager, grasping for any explanation that might support my claims of innocence. The systematic discrediting of our evidence was beginning before we had even presented it formally. 4 days later, I received a package in my detention cell that would change everything yet again. The manila envelope bore no return address and had somehow bypassed the facility's normal mail screening procedures, suggesting that whoever sent it had connections within the juvenile justice system itself. Inside the package were photographs that made my blood run cold with their implications. High-resolution images of Craig with Tommy in various locations, captured with the kind of professional surveillance equipment that suggested law enforcement involvement. The photos clearly showed inappropriate contact between Craig and my baby brother, documented with timestamps and location data that would be impossible to fabricate. Along with the photographs was a single sheet of paper containing a typewritten message that was both encouraging and terrifying in its implications. Someone else has been watching and documenting Craig Henderson's crimes. Continue to maintain your innocence. Do not reveal the existence of these photographs to anyone until you receive further instructions. Speaking out prematurely will result in harm to Tommy and the destruction of all evidence. You are not alone in this fight. The anonymous package confirmed that Jessica and I were indeed part of a larger investigation into Craig's activities, but it also revealed the dangerous nature of the forces we were challenging. Someone with access to sophisticated surveillance equipment and the ability to bypass security measures was monitoring the entire situation, gathering evidence while carefully timing its revelation to maximize impact. The warning about speaking out prematurely filled me with conflicting emotions. On one hand, I finally had photographic proof of Craig's crimes that could vindicate me immediately. On the other hand, the anonymous source was clearly indicating that premature disclosure would endanger Tommy and potentially destroy the larger case against Craig. 2 weeks after receiving the mysterious package, I learned why the anonymous source had urged caution. Jessica contacted Margaret Walsh with disturbing news about what had happened after her forced transfer from my case. Her new supervisor in adoption services had specifically warned her that pursuing any further involvement in child abuse investigations could result in criminal charges for interfering with ongoing prosecutions. They're claiming that Jessica's investigation techniques bordered on harassment and stalking, Margaret explained during our meeting. The department is suggesting that her emotional investment in your case compromised her professional judgment and led her to engage in unethical behavior that could taint any evidence she might have gathered. The systematic destruction of Jessica's credibility was clearly designed to ensure that any evidence she presented would be dismissed as the product of obsessive behavior rather than legitimate investigation. Craig's protectors were using Jessica's dedication to my case against her, turning her greatest strength into an apparent weakness. But there's something else, Margaret continued, lowering her voice despite the privacy of our conference room. Jessica asked me to tell you that certain people have been asking very specific questions about your family's background, particularly focusing on your relationship with your Aunt Patricia. She thinks someone is trying to identify potential allies who might support your version of events. The mention of my Aunt Patricia sent chills down my spine. I hadn't spoken to her in over a year, but she was one of the few family members who had always been skeptical of Craig's character and motivations. If someone was investigating her as a potential threat to their narrative, it suggested that our conspiracy reached beyond simple false accusations into active surveillance of anyone who might support me. The final confirmation that we were being systematically silenced came through an unexpected source. Frank Brennan, my foster father, who had been reporting on my activities to unknown handlers. During one of his regular phone calls, which I had learned to eavesdrop on whenever possible, he revealed the true scope of the pressure being applied to suppress our investigation. Yeah, they want me to document any unusual mail or visitors, Frank was saying to his contact. Apparently, there's concern that outside agitators might be trying to interfere with the prosecution by feeding the kid false hope about her case. They want to know immediately if anyone tries to contact her with information about alternative suspects or conspiracy theories. The phrase outside agitators confirmed that multiple people were aware of our investigation and were actively working to prevent its findings from reaching public attention. Craig's protection extended far beyond simple institutional corruption. It involved coordinated surveillance and interference with anyone who might threaten his carefully constructed narrative. As I lay in my narrow cot that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the detention facility while processing the implications of what I had learned, one thought dominated my consciousness. The anonymous photographs and Jessica's forced transfer had revealed both the existence of powerful allies and the determination of equally powerful enemies. Someone was indeed watching and documenting Craig's crimes with professional surveillance equipment, gathering evidence that could not only vindicate me, but potentially expose a larger network of corruption within the local justice system. But that same evidence was being carefully protected by people who understood that premature disclosure would result in its destruction and potentially endanger Tommy's safety. The real battle was no longer just about proving my innocence. It was about timing the revelation of truth in a way that would maximize its impact while minimizing the ability of corrupt officials to suppress or discredit it. Our anonymous ally was clearly playing a longer game, building a case that would be impossible to dismiss when finally revealed. But in the meantime, I had to endure continued persecution while my baby brother suffered ongoing abuse, trusting that unknown protectors were working behind the scenes to ensure that justice would ultimately prevail. The waiting was agony, but the alternative was the destruction of everything we had worked so hard to achieve. The truth was coming, but it would arrive on someone else's timeline when the moment was right for maximum devastation of Craig's carefully constructed lies. The revelation of my anonymous ally's identity came through yet another clandestine package, this one containing a cell phone programmed with a single contact number and detailed instructions for secure communication. The accompanying note explained that direct contact had become necessary due to escalating threats against Tommy's safety and increasing pressure to suppress our evidence. Call this number at exactly 9 p.m. tonight. The note instructed. Speak only from the location specified in the enclosed map. Trust no one else with information about this communication. Your brother's life depends on absolute discretion. The specified location was a payphone outside a convenience store 3 miles from the detention facility, accessible only during my weekly supervised visits to the facility's medical clinic. Using my history of compliance and good behavior, I convinced the transport officer to allow a brief stop for emergency feminine supplies, providing just enough time to make the crucial call. The voice that answered was familiar, yet unexpected. My Aunt Patricia, my mother's estranged sister who had been absent from our family's life for over 2 years, following a bitter dispute with Craig about his treatment of Linda and her children. Dakota, sweetheart, I've been working for months to gather evidence that would prove your innocence, Patricia said, her voice heavy with emotion and determination. I've been watching Craig since the day he married your mother, and I knew it was only a matter of time before his true nature emerged. Patricia's revelation that she had been systematically monitoring Craig's behavior provided the missing piece of the puzzle that explained how our anonymous ally had access to such detailed surveillance equipment and intimate knowledge of his criminal activities. As a retired police detective with 25 years of experience in criminal investigation, she possessed both the skills and connections necessary to conduct professional-level surveillance. I tried to warn Linda about Craig before they married. Patricia continued, her voice filled with regret and frustration. I ran background checks that revealed concerning patterns in his employment history and personal relationships. But your mother was so desperate for financial stability that she refused to listen to my concerns. The family conflict that had resulted in Patricia's estrangement suddenly made sense in the context of Craig's systematic manipulation of our household. He had recognized Patricia as the greatest threat to his plans and had worked systematically to poison Linda's relationship with her sister, ensuring that his most knowledgeable potential opponent was excluded from family gatherings and decision-making. When I heard about the charges against you, I knew immediately that Craig was somehow involved, Patricia explained. The timing was too convenient, coming just as his background check for the promotion was being finalized. I started surveillance that same week and began documenting his actual behavior with Tommy. Patricia's professional investigation had produced a comprehensive file of evidence that went far beyond anything Jessica and I had managed to compile. Months of systematic surveillance had captured Craig's criminal activities with the kind of detail and documentation that would be impossible to challenge in court. I have over 40 hours of video footage showing Craig abusing Tommy in various locations. Patricia revealed, her voice breaking with emotion as she described the extent of her nephew's suffering. I also have audio recordings of him coaching Melody's testimony and detailed financial records showing payments to individuals who helped suppress evidence and redirect the investigation toward you. The scope of Patricia's investigation was staggering in its comprehensiveness and professionalism. She had not only documented Craig's crimes, but had also traced the corruption that protected him, identifying specific individuals within law enforcement and child services who had been compromised through bribes, threats, or professional relationships. But Dakota, what I've discovered goes beyond just Craig's individual crimes. Patricia continued, her voice taking on the gravity of someone revealing information of enormous significance. He's part of a larger network of predators who use their professional positions to access and abuse children while protecting each other from prosecution. The revelation that Craig was connected to an organized network of child abusers transformed my understanding of both the crimes against Tommy and the systematic effort to frame me for those crimes. This wasn't just about one predator protecting himself. It was about an entire criminal organization that had infiltrated local institutions to ensure their continued operations. Patricia's investigation had uncovered connections between Craig and at least 6 other individuals in positions of authority within the county, including 2 police officers, a family court judge, a school administrator, and a pediatrician who had been deliberately misdiagnosing signs of abuse to protect members of their network. The network operates by sharing victims and providing alibis for each other during suspicious incidents. Patricia explained, detailing the sophisticated operation that had been functioning in our community for years. When one member faces potential exposure, the others work together to redirect suspicion toward innocent targets while suppressing evidence that might reveal their collective crimes. My false prosecution had apparently served as a template for the network's defensive strategies, demonstrating how easily they could destroy innocent lives when their operations were threatened. The systematic corruption of multiple agencies and the coordinated suppression of evidence revealed capabilities that extended far beyond what any individual predator could achieve alone. I've been building cases against all of them simultaneously, Patricia continued, but the investigation requires perfect timing and coordination with federal authorities who are outside the network's sphere of influence. That's why I couldn't reveal the evidence earlier. Exposing Craig prematurely would have allowed the other members to escape prosecution. The explanation for the careful timing of evidence revelation finally made sense. Patricia wasn't just trying to vindicate me. She was working to destroy an entire criminal organization that had been operating with impunity for years. My case had become the key to exposing systematic corruption that affected dozens of victims across multiple families. Well, Patricia, what about Tommy? I asked, my voice breaking as I thought about my baby brother continuing to suffer while we built cases against his abusers. How much longer can we let Craig hurt him while we wait for the perfect moment to act? That's why I'm contacting you now, Patricia replied, her voice taking on new urgency. The federal investigation is nearly complete, but Craig is becoming increasingly desperate and dangerous as he senses the walls closing around him. I have credible intelligence suggesting that he's planning to flee the country with Tommy, claiming that your mother is no longer capable of caring for the child due to the family trauma. The threat of Craig disappearing with Tommy added a terrifying new dimension to our race against time. If he successfully removed my brother from the jurisdiction before federal authorities could act, Tommy might disappear forever into whatever network of predators Craig was connected to internationally. We have less than 2 weeks before Craig finalizes his travel arrangements, Patricia warned. After that, Tommy will be beyond our reach, and the entire investigation will collapse because we'll lose access to our primary victim and witness. The countdown to action had begun, but Patricia's next revelation provided hope that our months of careful preparation were finally approaching their culmination. I've been working directly with FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen, who specializes in organized child abuse cases. She's convinced her superiors to authorize a coordinated operation that will arrest all network members simultaneously while securing Tommy's safety. The involvement of federal authorities explained the sophisticated surveillance capabilities and systematic evidence gathering that had characterized our anonymous allies' operations. Patricia hadn't been working alone. She had been serving as a local contact for a federal investigation that viewed my case as the gateway to exposing much larger criminal enterprise. The operation is scheduled for next Friday. Patricia revealed Craig and 5 other network members will be arrested simultaneously on federal charges, while Tommy is placed in protective custody with trained specialists who understand the complexity of his trauma. As our conversation neared its conclusion, Patricia shared one final piece of information that would sustain me through the remaining days of uncertainty and fear. Dakota, I want you to know that Linda is not part of Craig's network. She's been systematically manipulated and psychologically abused to ensure her compliance, but she genuinely believes that you're guilty because Craig has been gaslighting her for months. The possibility that my mother might be redeemable provided a glimmer of hope for eventual family reconciliation once Craig's manipulation was exposed and his lies were revealed. Linda's betrayal had been the product of sophisticated psychological manipulation rather than malicious intent, suggesting that healing might be possible after justice was served. When this is over, your mother will need extensive therapy to process the reality of what Craig did to all of you, Patricia said gently. But underneath all the manipulation and fear, she still loves you. That love will return once she understands the truth about who Craig really is. As I hung up the payphone and returned to the detention facility, my mind reeled with the implications of Patricia's revelations. In less than 2 weeks, the nightmare that had consumed my life for over a year would finally end, but not just with my vindication. Craig's arrest would be part of a federal operation that would expose an entire network of predators and protect dozens of potential future victims. The truth was finally coming, and it would arrive, with the full force of federal law enforcement behind it. The confrontation with my mother came sooner than anyone had anticipated, triggered by Tommy's sudden hospitalization, following what Craig claimed was a playground accident, but what emergency room doctors recognized as clear evidence of severe physical abuse. Patricia's federal contacts ensured that she was immediately notified of Tommy's condition, prompting an emergency acceleration of the planned operation. "We can't wait for Friday," Patricia told me during a hastily arranged phone call to the detention facility. Tommy's injuries are so severe that Child Protective Services has to act immediately, which means Craig knows his time is running out. He's going to either flee or take more drastic action to silence potential witnesses. Tommy's hospitalization had finally provided medical professionals with undeniable evidence of ongoing abuse that couldn't be explained away through Craig's carefully prepared stories. X-rays revealed multiple fractures in various stages of healing, indicating systematic physical violence that had been occurring for months, while I remained incarcerated for crimes I didn't commit. Patricia had used her law enforcement connections to ensure that Tommy's medical examination was conducted by specialists trained in recognizing signs of child abuse, preventing Craig from manipulating the findings through his insurance company contacts. The hospital's security team had also been alerted to prevent any unauthorized visitors from gaining access to Tommy during his vulnerable state. Linda is at the hospital now, and she's starting to ask questions that Craig can't answer, Patricia continued. The doctors are being very direct about the evidence they've found, and even your mother can't ignore the implications of Tommy's injuries when presented with professional medical testimony. The moment had come for a direct confrontation with the family that had abandoned me based on Craig's lies. Patricia had arranged for me to be transported to the hospital under the guise of a medical consultation, providing an opportunity for the truth to finally emerge in Linda's presence while Tommy's condition made denial impossible. Dakota, I need you to understand that what happens next will be emotionally devastating for everyone involved, Patricia warned as we prepared for the confrontation. Your mother is about to discover that she married a monster and that her blind trust in Craig resulted in the systematic abuse of both her children. She's going to need support, not condemnation, if we want any hope of family reconciliation. The pediatric wing of Marion General Hospital felt like a battlefield as I walked through corridors lined with cheerful decorations that seemed to mock the horrible reality of why we were all gathered there. Patricia met me outside Tommy's room, her expression grim but determined, as she prepared to orchestrate the most crucial conversation of our investigation. Linda was sitting beside Tommy's bed when we entered, holding his small hand while tears streamed down her face. My baby brother looked so fragile, connected to monitoring equipment, his body bearing visible evidence of the abuse that I had been falsely accused of inflicting. The sight of his injuries filled me with rage that threatened to overwhelm my ability to remain composed. Mom, I said quietly, my voice breaking as I saw my mother for the first time in over a year. I need you to listen to what Patricia has to tell you. Tommy's injuries prove that someone has been hurting him while I've been locked away for crimes I didn't commit. Linda's initial reaction was exactly what Craig's manipulation had programmed her to expect. How dare you come here and try to blame someone else for what you did to him? She said, her voice filled with the kind of righteous anger that only comes from absolute certainty about moral positions. But Patricia was ready for Linda's defensive response with evidence that would shatter her carefully constructed reality. Linda, I've been conducting surveillance of Craig Henderson for the past 8 months, she said, pulling out a tablet loaded with video files. What I'm about to show you will prove that Dakota is innocent and that your husband is the real perpetrator. The first video showed Craig taking Tommy to an isolated parking lot behind an abandoned warehouse, clearly visible through Patricia's telephoto surveillance equipment. The timestamp indicated that the recording had been made while Linda was working a double shift at the nursing home, providing Craig with extended, unsupervised access to his victim. Linda's face went white as she watched Craig's interaction with Tommy in the video, her hand flying to her mouth as she witnessed behavior that left no doubt about the true nature of their relationship. This can't be real, she whispered, her voice hollow with shock and disbelief. There are 43 hours of similar footage, Patricia said gently but firmly. Craig has been systematically abusing Tommy while manipulating you into believing that Dakota was responsible. He orchestrated this entire conspiracy to protect himself and eliminate the person most likely to recognize and report his crimes. The medical evidence corroborated Patricia's surveillance footage with devastating precision. Dr. Amanda Foster, the pediatric specialist treating Tommy, had documented injuries that perfectly matched the time frame of Craig's documented abuse, proving that Linda's own husband had been torturing her child while she worked to support their family. Mrs. Henderson, I need you to understand the severity of what we've discovered, Dr. Foster said, showing Linda detailed medical reports that chronicled Tommy's suffering. These injuries indicate sustained physical and sexual abuse over a period of many months. The perpetrator used sophisticated techniques designed to minimize visible evidence while maximizing psychological control. Linda's world was collapsing in real time as she processed the overwhelming evidence of Craig's crimes and her own unwitting complicity in Tommy's abuse. The woman who had raised me, loved me, and ultimately betrayed me was discovering that her entire reality for the past 2 years had been constructed from lies and manipulation. But Craig loves Tommy, Linda said weakly, clinging to the last vestiges of her shattered worldview. He's always been so protective of him, always worried about his safety and well-being. He was the one who insisted we pursue charges against Dakota to protect our family. Patricia's next revelation delivered the final blow to Linda's denial. Craig manipulated your protective instincts to serve his own criminal purposes, she explained. He convinced you that pursuing charges against Dakota was necessary to protect Tommy, when in reality he was eliminating the person most likely to expose his own abuse. The audio recordings of Craig coaching Melody's testimony provided undeniable proof of his manipulation of our entire family. Linda listened in horror as Craig's voice instructed her younger daughter on exactly what to say about me teaching her to describe abuse that was actually happening to Tommy but attributing it to his innocent sister. He turned my daughters against each other, Linda said, her voice breaking as the full scope of Craig's manipulation became clear. He used my love for my children to destroy my own family while he continued hurting the baby I was trying to protect. The conversation that followed was perhaps the most emotionally devastating of my entire life, but also the most necessary for any hope of healing our shattered family relationships. Linda finally understood that her betrayal of me had been orchestrated by the very person she had trusted to protect us, and that her loyalty to Craig had enabled continued abuse of the child she thought she was defending. Dakota, I don't know how to ask for forgiveness for what I've done to you, Linda said, reaching toward me with trembling hands. I believed him when he said you were sick, when he said you needed help that I couldn't provide. I thought I was protecting Tommy by supporting your prosecution. The moment I had dreamed of for over a year had finally arrived, but it felt nothing like I had imagined. Instead of vindication and triumph, I felt overwhelming sadness for the destruction that Craig's manipulation had wrought on our entire family. Linda wasn't the villain of my story. She was another victim of a predator who had systematically exploited her vulnerabilities. Mom, Craig is a professional manipulator who has been doing this to families for years, I said, taking her hand and feeling the calluses from years of nursing work that had been supporting his criminal lifestyle. You're not responsible for failing to see through lies that fooled social workers, police officers, and prosecutors. He's just that good at what he does. Patricia's investigation had revealed that Linda herself had been subjected to sophisticated psychological abuse designed to isolate her from potential sources of support while maximizing her dependence on Craig's approval and financial contribution. The manipulation had been so gradual and subtle that even trained professionals might have missed the signs. As we sat beside Tommy's hospital bed, surrounded by evidence of the abuse that had been hidden for so long, Linda made a decision that would determine the future of our family's healing. "What do I need to do to help put Craig away forever?" she asked, her voice filled with determination that reminded me of the strong woman who had raised me. "You need to cooperate fully with the federal investigation and be prepared to testify about Craig's manipulation of your family," Patricia replied. "But most importantly, you need to understand that healing from this kind of systematic abuse will require extensive therapy for all of you, including yourself." The confrontation that had begun with anger and denial ended with the first tentative steps toward family reconciliation and Tommy's protection. But even as we planned for Craig's arrest and prosecution, all of us understood that the damage he had inflicted would take years to fully address. The truth had finally emerged, but the real work of healing our family was just beginning. The collapse of Melody's fabricated testimony began 3 days after our family confrontation at the hospital, when federal agents presented her with irrefutable video evidence of Craig's abuse while she was being interviewed at the crisis center where she had volunteered. Special Agent Sarah Chen had orchestrated the interview location, deliberately surrounding Melody with counselors who specialized in helping teenage victims of manipulation and coercion. "Melody, we need you to look at these photographs and videos very carefully," Agent Chen said gently, her voice carrying the authority of someone experienced in handling traumatized witnesses. "We want you to tell us if you recognize the activities shown in these images and whether they match what you described happening between Dakota and Tommy." The surveillance footage that Patricia had gathered over months of investigation showed Craig engaging in the exact behaviors that Melody had attributed to me in her detailed testimony. The criminal acts were identical in every specific detail down to locations within our house and particular phrases that Craig used to ensure Tommy's silence and compliance. Melody's reaction to seeing the truth documented so clearly was immediate and devastating. The careful composure that had characterized her testimony throughout my prosecution crumbled as she realized that her lies had been protecting the very person who was actually abusing Tommy while she destroyed her innocent sister's life. "That's not supposed to be Craig," Melody whispered, her voice breaking as she pointed at the screen showing her stepfather engaged in the criminal behavior she had falsely attributed to me. "Craig told me that Dakota was doing these things to Tommy. He said I had to stop her before she hurt him worse." Agent Chen had been specifically trained to handle situations where young witnesses had been manipulated into providing false testimony, and she recognized the signs of sophisticated psychological coercion that had shaped Melody's accusations against me. My sister hadn't been maliciously lying. She had been systematically groomed to believe and repeat information that served Craig's criminal purposes. "Melody, can you tell us exactly how Craig first approached you about these accusations against your sister?" Agent Chen asked, her voice maintaining the careful balance between authority and compassion that was necessary to extract truth from a traumatized teenager. The story that emerged from Melody's confession revealed the calculating nature of Craig's manipulation and the sophisticated psychological techniques he had used to transform my sister into an unwitting weapon against me. The process had begun months before my arrest with Craig, gradually introducing ideas about my supposedly suspicious behavior, while positioning himself as the only adult capable of protecting our family. He started by asking me if I had ever noticed anything unusual about how Dakota interacted with Tommy. Melody explained, tears streaming down her face as she recounted Craig's systematic grooming process. At first, I said no because there was never anything wrong with how she treated him, but Craig kept asking different questions and suggesting things I should watch for. Craig's manipulation had exploited Melody's natural teenage insecurities and her desire to be treated as a mature adult capable of handling serious family responsibilities. He had convinced her that she was the only person observant enough to recognize subtle signs of abuse that were invisible to adults, making her feel special and important while gradually corrupting her perception of reality. He gave me books about child abuse and showed me educational videos about how predators operate. Melody continued, her voice filled with self-recrimination as she realized how thoroughly she had been deceived. He said I needed to educate myself so I could protect Tommy from Dakota's sickness and help her get the treatment she needed. The educational materials that Craig provided had served a dual purpose. They gave Melody the sophisticated vocabulary and detailed knowledge that made her testimony so convincing, while simultaneously programming her to interpret innocent interactions between me and Tommy as evidence of criminal behavior. Craig had essentially trained my sister to see abuse where none existed while remaining blind to his own criminal activities. Craig told me that Dakota had learned how to hide her abuse so well that even trained professionals might miss the signs. Melody explained, revealing the psychological foundation that had made her immune to doubt about her accusations. He said that family members were often the only ones who could detect such subtle manipulation, which made my testimony crucial for Tommy's protection. Agent Chen's questioning revealed that Craig had spent months preparing Melody for her eventual testimony, coaching her on specific details and phrases that would be most damaging to my defense, while ensuring that her accusations would be difficult to challenge in court. The diary entries that had seemed so damning during my prosecution had been written under Craig's direct supervision, with him suggesting specific incidents and helping Melody craft descriptions that would resonate with investigators. He helped me organize my thoughts and write things down in a way that adults would understand. Melody admitted, her voice barely audible as she described her unwitting collaboration in my persecution. Craig said that if I didn't document everything carefully, Dakota might find a way to escape consequences and continue hurting Tommy. The revelation that Craig had been the actual author of much of Melody's testimony explained the clinical precision and psychological sophistication that had impressed prosecutors and social workers. My sister hadn't developed detailed knowledge of abuse patterns through personal observation. She had been systematically educated by a predator who understood exactly what testimony would be most effective in ensuring my conviction. But the worst part, Melody said, breaking down completely as the full scope of her manipulation became clear, is that Craig told me the lies were actually a form of love. He said that by accusing Dakota, I was protecting both her and Tommy from worse consequences that would happen if the abuse continued. Craig's psychological manipulation had been so sophisticated that he had convinced Melody that lying about me was actually an act of compassion designed to help our entire family. He had exploited her genuine love for both Tommy and me, twisting her protective instincts into weapons that served his criminal purposes while making her feel like a hero rather than an accomplice. The counselors present during Melody's confession recognize the classic patterns of coercive control that predators use to manipulate teenage victims into complying with their demands. Craig had employed techniques typically associated with cult recruitment, gradually isolating Melody's judgment while making her completely dependent on his interpretation of reality. "But Melody, I need you to understand something very important," said Dr. Rebecca Thompson, a specialist in adolescent trauma who had been brought in to support Melody through her confession. "What Craig did to you is a form of abuse that's specifically designed to make victims feel responsible for consequences that aren't their fault. You were manipulated by someone who understood exactly how to exploit your love for your family." The psychological evaluation that followed Melody's breakdown revealed the extent to which Craig's manipulation had damaged her sense of reality and moral judgment. She had been living in a state of constant anxiety and guilt, torn between her genuine love for me and her programmed belief that I represented a threat to Tommy's safety. I kept hoping that Dakota would confess and get help, Melody admitted during one particularly emotional session with Dr. Thompson. Craig told me that as long as she denied what she was doing, she couldn't receive proper treatment. I thought that by maintaining my accusations, I was giving her opportunities to admit the truth and start healing. The revelation that Melody had been motivated by a desire to help me rather than destroy me provided crucial insight into Craig's manipulation techniques. He had convinced her that my persecution was actually a form of intervention designed to save me from my own supposed sickness, making her feel compassionate rather than cruel as she delivered the testimony that nearly destroyed my life. But I started having doubts after Dakota was arrested. Melody continued, her voice breaking as she described months of internal conflict that Craig had worked systematically to suppress. She seemed so genuinely confused and hurt by my accusations. Sometimes I wondered if I had misunderstood what I was seeing, but Craig always reassured me that denial was a common response from people who needed help. Agent Chen's investigation revealed that Craig had been monitoring Melody's emotional state carefully throughout my prosecution, adjusting his manipulation techniques whenever she showed signs of wavering in her commitment to the false narrative. He had used a combination of emotional manipulation, psychological pressure, and carefully timed reassurance to maintain her compliance even when her own instincts suggested that something was wrong. The hardest part was seeing how much pain Dakota was in. Melody said, sobbing as she confronted the reality of what her lies had cost me. But Craig kept telling me that short-term pain was necessary to prevent long-term damage, and that Dakota would eventually thank me for having the courage to speak out when she realized how sick she had been. As Melody's confession continued over several sessions, the full scope of Craig's psychological manipulation became clear. He had essentially brainwashed a vulnerable teenager into believing that destroying her sister's life was an act of love using sophisticated techniques that had prevented her from recognizing the contradictions in his narrative until confronted with overwhelming evidence of his own crimes. Melody, what happened to you and your family represents one of the most sophisticated manipulation schemes I've encountered in 15 years of federal investigations, Agent Chen told her as the confession sessions concluded. Craig Henderson used professional-level psychological techniques that are typically associated with organized criminal enterprises specializing in the exploitation of children and families. The revelation that Melody had been as much a victim as Tommy and I provided the foundation for eventual family healing, but it also highlighted the devastating effectiveness of Craig's criminal methodology. He had turned loving family relationships into weapons against each other, ensuring that his victims would destroy themselves while he remained protected and undetected. I don't know how to live with what I've done to Dakota, Melody said during her final interview with Agent Chen. How do I ask forgiveness from someone whose life I destroyed based on lies that I thought were protecting our family? The question of forgiveness and family reconciliation would require years of therapy and careful rebuilding of trust, but Melody's confession had provided the crucial evidence needed to ensure Craig's prosecution and Tommy's protection. More importantly, it had revealed the true scope of the criminal conspiracy that had nearly destroyed our entire family while protecting a predator who had been operating with impunity for years. The truth was finally fully exposed, but the healing process was only beginning. The federal courthouse in Indianapolis became the stage for Craig Henderson's downfall on a cold Monday morning in November, exactly 14 months after his manipulation had first destroyed my life through Melody's false accusations. Special Agent Sarah Chen had coordinated with local authorities to ensure that Craig's arrest would be swift, public, and impossible for his network of corrupt allies to interfere with or suppress. Craig was taken into custody at his workplace, surrounded by colleagues who had celebrated his recent promotion and respected his apparent dedication to family values. The charges read against him included multiple counts of child sexual abuse, witness tampering conspiracy to obstruct justice, and participation in a criminal enterprise spanning 3 states and involving at least 12 other defendants. The arrest of Craig Henderson represents the culmination of an 18-month federal investigation into a sophisticated network of child predators who use their professional positions to access victims while corrupting law enforcement and social services to protect their criminal activities, announced FBI Special Agent in Charge Michael Rodriguez during a press conference that would vindicate me before the entire community that had shunned me. The evidence against Craig was overwhelming and irrefutable, built from Patricia's months of surveillance, Tommy's medical records, Melody's recorded confessions, and testimony from victims in other states who had been located through the federal investigation. His network of corrupt allies within local law enforcement and child services had been simultaneously arrested, ensuring that no one remained in position to suppress evidence or manipulate proceedings. Margaret Walsh, my long-suffering public defender, had the honor of presenting the motion to dismiss all charges against me, a moment that represented not just legal vindication, but validation of her persistent advocacy despite overwhelming pressure to accept plea bargains that would have destroyed my future. Your Honor, in light of overwhelming evidence proving my client's complete innocence and identifying the actual perpetrator of the crimes for which she was charged, the defense moves for immediate dismissal of all charges and full expungement of Dakota Henderson's record. Margaret announced to Judge Patricia Williams, the same jurist who had presided over months of hearings that had painted me as a dangerous predator. Judge Williams had the grace to look genuinely shaken as she reviewed the evidence that had emerged from the federal investigation, evidence that revealed how thoroughly her courtroom had been manipulated by criminal defendants who had used the legal system itself as a weapon against innocent victims. Ms. Henderson, this court owes you an apology that can never adequately address the injustice you have endured. Judge Williams said, her voice heavy with professional embarrassment and personal regret. The charges against you are hereby dismissed with prejudice. Your record is ordered expunged, and this court directs that you receive priority consideration for any compensation programs available to victims of wrongful prosecution. The formal declaration of my innocence felt both triumphant and hollow, marking the end of a nightmare that should never have been permitted to begin. 14 months of my life had been stolen, my family had been shattered, and my baby brother had suffered continued abuse while a corrupt system pursued his innocent sister based on fabricated evidence and manipulated testimony. District Attorney Robert Chen, who had prosecuted my case with such venomous determination, now faced federal investigation for his role in suppressing evidence and accepting the coach testimony that he should have recognized as suspicious. His political career was effectively overdestroyed by revelations that he had prioritized conviction rates over truth and justice. The prosecution of Dakota Henderson represents a systematic failure of our local justice system that allowed personal ambition and institutional corruption to override basic investigative competence, announced federal prosecutor Diana Martinez, who would be handling the cases against Craig's entire network. This young woman's persecution was not an isolated mistake. It was the deliberate result of a criminal conspiracy that infiltrated multiple agencies. The civil rights violations that had characterized my prosecution were extensive enough to warrant federal intervention under laws designed to protect citizens from systematic abuse by government officials. Craig's network had essentially transformed local law enforcement and child services into tools for protecting their criminal enterprise while destroying anyone who posed a threat to their operations. Tommy's rescue from Craig's custody had required immediate medical and psychological intervention to address the trauma he had endured during months of abuse while his supposed protectors pursued his innocent sister. The little boy who had been the true victim throughout this entire ordeal would require years of specialized therapy to overcome the damage inflicted by his stepfather's criminal behavior. Tommy Henderson has been placed in protective custody with relatives trained to provide appropriate care for child victims of severe abuse. Agent Chen announced during the press conference that revealed the scope of the federal investigation. His recovery will be supported by specialist teams experienced in addressing the complex trauma associated with systematic predatory behavior. The revelation that Craig's crimes extended far beyond our family provided context for the sophisticated methodology he had used to frame me for his own criminal behavior. Federal investigators had identified at least 8 other families in 3 different states where similar patterns of manipulation and false accusations had been used to protect network members from prosecution. Craig Henderson's case represents a template that this criminal network has used repeatedly to avoid accountability for their crimes, explained Agent Rodriguez. They identify potential whistleblowers within their target families, then orchestrate false accusations that discredit and remove those individuals while providing cover for continued abuse of remaining victims. The psychological evaluation that accompanied my legal vindication revealed the extent of trauma I had endured during months of wrongful incarceration and systematic persecution by authorities who should have been protecting me. The deliberate nature of my persecution qualified me for victim compensation programs typically reserved for survivors of organized criminal activity. Dr. Patricia Evans, the pediatrician whose concerns about Tommy's condition had been suppressed by Craig's insurance company connections, testified before federal investigators about the systematic corruption she had witnessed within local medical and social services systems. I documented clear evidence of ongoing child abuse that should have triggered immediate investigation and intervention. Dr. Evans explained during congressional hearings that would result from the federal investigation. Instead, my reports were buried by administrators who prioritized protecting certain individuals over safeguarding vulnerable children. The network's ability to suppress medical evidence and manipulate child protective services had enabled them to operate with impunity for years, destroying multiple families, while ensuring that their criminal activities remained hidden from federal oversight. My case had provided the breakthrough that exposed their entire operation to scrutiny they could not escape or influence. Margaret Walsh's persistent advocacy throughout my prosecution was recognized by the State Bar Association, which presented her with an award for extraordinary dedication to justice under circumstances designed to discourage effective representation. Her refusal to accept the official narrative despite overwhelming institutional pressure had been crucial to preserving evidence that eventually led to Craig's exposure. Dakota Henderson's case demonstrates the importance of defense attorneys who are willing to challenge institutional corruption, even when doing so threatens their own careers, announced State Bar President Jennifer Morrison during the award ceremony. Margaret Walsh's dedication to her client's innocence in the face of systematic opposition exemplifies the highest ideals of our legal profession. The media attention surrounding Craig's arrest and my vindication transformed me from a pariah into a symbol of resilience in the face of institutional corruption. News outlets across the country covered the story as an example of how organized criminal enterprises could manipulate local justice systems to protect their operations while destroying innocent lives. Dakota Henderson's courage in maintaining her innocence despite overwhelming pressure to confess to crimes she didn't commit has exposed a criminal conspiracy that might have continued operating indefinitely, wrote investigative journalist David Kim in a series that won national awards for exposing corruption within law enforcement and child services agencies. As I walked out of the courthouse, a free and vindicated woman surrounded by the family members who had finally learned the truth about Craig's manipulation and my innocence, I understood that justice had been served, but healing would require much more time and effort. The legal system had finally acknowledged its failures, but rebuilding my life and my family's relationships would be a longer and more complex process. The truth had prevailed, but only after demonstrating how easily it could be suppressed by people willing to sacrifice innocent lives to protect their criminal enterprises. My vindication was complete, but the scars left by 14 months of wrongful persecution would take much longer to heal. The process of rebuilding our family began in the psychiatric wing of Riley Hospital for Children, where Tommy was receiving intensive therapy to address the complex trauma he had endured during Craig's systematic abuse. Dr. Amanda Foster, the pediatric specialist overseeing his care, had recommended family therapy sessions that would allow us to reconnect while supporting Tommy's healing process. Tommy's recovery requires him to rebuild trust with the family members who will be providing his long-term care. Dr. Foster explained during our first meeting since my vindication, but we need to proceed carefully as he's been programmed to associate family interactions with danger and secrecy. My baby brother, now 4 years old, barely remembered me from before my arrest. His memories of our relationship had been systematically poisoned by Craig's manipulation, which had taught him to view me as a source of danger rather than protection. The little boy who had once run to me for comfort now cringed when I entered his hospital room. Linda's journey toward accepting her role in our family's destruction required separate counseling sessions that addressed her own victimization by Craig's psychological manipulation. Dr. Rebecca Thompson, the specialist working with our family, explained that Linda had been subjected to sophisticated, coercive control techniques that had systematically undermined her judgment and isolated her from potential sources of support. Your mother was systematically groomed to distrust her own instincts while becoming completely dependent on Craig's interpretation of reality, Dr. Thompson explained during one of our joint sessions. The betrayal you experienced was real and devastating, but it was orchestrated by someone who understood exactly how to exploit her vulnerabilities as a single mother desperate to protect her children. The evidence of Linda's own abuse emerged gradually through therapy sessions that revealed the extent of Craig's control over every aspect of her life. He had monitored her communications, controlled her finances, isolated her from friends and family, and used her love for her children as leverage to ensure her compliance with his demands. I stopped trusting my own judgment because Craig always seemed to know things that I missed, Linda admitted during one particularly emotional session. When he pointed out signs that Dakota might be sick, I felt like a failure as a mother for not seeing them myself. I thought I needed his guidance to protect my children properly. Craig's manipulation had been so systematic that Linda had gradually transferred all decision-making authority to him, believing that her own instincts were unreliable and potentially dangerous to her family's welfare. The false accusations against me had been just one element of a comprehensive campaign designed to ensure Linda's complete dependence on Craig's supposed expertise in family dynamics. He convinced me that Dakota was manipulating me through my emotions, that my love for her was making me blind to signs that other people could see clearly. Linda continued, tears streaming down her face as she confronted the reality of how thoroughly she had been deceived. I thought I was being strong and responsible by supporting charges against her, even though every instinct I had told me she was innocent. Melody's participation in our family therapy required addressing her own trauma while helping her understand that her manipulation by Craig didn't diminish her responsibility for the consequences of her false testimony. Dr. Thompson worked carefully to balance accountability with compassion, recognizing that Melody had been both a victim and an unwitting accomplice in my persecution. I knew something felt wrong about the accusations from the beginning. Melody admitted during our first joint session, her voice heavy with guilt and self-recrimination. But Craig made me feel like doubting the evidence was a betrayal of Tommy, and a sign that I was too immature to handle adult responsibilities. The sophisticated psychological techniques that Craig had used to manipulate Melody involved exploiting her natural adolescent desire for recognition and authority, while gradually corrupting her sense of truth and reality. He had convinced her that she was the only family member mature enough to see through my supposed deception, making her feel special and important while isolating her from contrary evidence. Craig taught me to interpret everything Dakota did as evidence of her sickness. Melody continued struggling to articulate how thoroughly her perception had been distorted. When she denied the accusations, he said that was typical manipulative behavior. When she seemed genuinely confused and hurt, he said that was proof of how dangerous her delusions had become. The rebuilding of trust between Melody and me required extensive work on both our parts, as I struggled to forgive someone who had destroyed my life, while she grappled with the reality of having been used as a weapon against her own sister. Dr. Thompson facilitated conversations that allowed us to understand each other's experiences without minimizing the pain that had resulted from Craig's manipulation. Whoa, Dakota, I need you to understand that Melody was subjected to the same type of coercive control that's used by human traffickers and cult leaders. Dr. Thompson explained during one of our sessions, the techniques Craig used are specifically designed to override rational judgment and moral intuition, making victims complicit in their own exploitation. The therapeutic process revealed that Craig had been grooming our entire family for years before implementing his plan to frame me for his own crimes. He had systematically identified each family member's vulnerabilities and gradually exploited them to ensure our mutual destruction while protecting himself from detection and prosecution. Craig studied our family dynamics like a scientist studying laboratory specimens. I observed during one session, finally understanding the methodical nature of the manipulation we had all endured. He knew exactly which emotional buttons to push with each of us to achieve the reactions he needed. The sessions with Tommy were perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of our family therapy, as the little boy struggled to understand why the adults in his life had failed to protect him while pursuing his innocent sister for crimes she didn't commit. His trauma was so extensive that initial interactions had to be carefully supervised to prevent additional psychological damage. Tommy's been taught to blame himself for the conflict in our family, Dr. Foster explained during a consultation about his treatment plan. Craig convinced him that the abuse was punishment for being a bad boy who caused problems between his family members. The process of helping Tommy understand that none of the adults' behavior had been his responsibility required delicate therapeutic techniques designed to rebuild his sense of safety and self-worth. His recovery would take years, but the first steps involved establishing that he was surrounded by people committed to his protection and healing. "We're going to make sure you're safe now," I promised Tommy during one of our supervised visits, speaking in the gentle tone I remembered from before Craig had poisoned our relationship. "Nobody is going to hurt you anymore, and nobody is going to make you keep secrets about things that make you feel bad." Linda's efforts to rebuild her relationship with me required her to confront the reality that her betrayal had been based on lies she should have questioned more aggressively. The guilt she carried was enormous. But Dr. Thompson helped us understand that healing required focusing on current behavior rather than past mistakes. "I can't change what I did to you, but I can make sure it never happens again," Linda said during one of our most difficult sessions. "I'm learning to trust my own instincts again and to never let anyone else override my judgment about my children's welfare." The family reconciliation process was complicated by the reality that Craig's manipulation had created genuine trauma for all of us. Trauma that couldn't be erased simply by understanding its origins. We each required individual therapy to address our specific experiences while participating in joint sessions designed to rebuild our relationships. Whoa, healing from this kind of systematic manipulation requires patience and commitment from everyone involved, Dr. Thompson explained as we prepared for the long-term work of family reconstruction. You've all survived something that destroys many families completely, and your willingness to work together gives you a real chance at building something stronger than what you had before. 6 months into our family therapy, we had established a foundation for rebuilding relationships based on honesty communication and mutual respect. Tommy was beginning to trust me again. Linda had learned to recognize and resist manipulation, and Melody was developing the critical thinking skills that would protect her from future exploitation. We're not trying to go back to the way things were before Craig, I explained during one of our sessions. We're building something completely new based on what we've learned about protecting each other from people who would use our love against us. The process was slow, painful, and sometimes frustrating, but it was also healing in ways that I hadn't expected. Our shared trauma had given us a deep understanding of each other's vulnerabilities and a commitment to protecting each other that was stronger than our relationships had been before Craig's manipulation nearly destroyed us. For the first time in over 2 years, I had hoped that our family could not only survive, but emerge stronger from the devastation that Craig had orchestrated. The road ahead was long, but we were finally walking it together. The transformation of Melody from unwitting accomplice to powerful advocate began during Craig's federal trial, where she courageously testified about the systematic manipulation she had endured while delivering the false accusations that had nearly destroyed my life. Her testimony was crucial not just for ensuring Craig's conviction, but for exposing the sophisticated techniques he had used to corrupt the judgment of a vulnerable teenager. I need the court to understand that I genuinely believed I was protecting my family when I accused my sister. Melody testified, her voice steady, despite the emotional weight of publicly acknowledging her role in my persecution. Craig Henderson spent months teaching me to see abuse where none existed, while remaining blind to the real crimes he was committing against my baby brother. Federal prosecutor Diana Martinez had prepared Melody carefully for her testimony, understanding that her credibility would be crucial for demonstrating the extent of Craig's manipulation and the sophistication of the criminal network he represented. Melody's willingness to admit her own deception while explaining the psychological coercion she had endured provided powerful evidence of Craig's criminal methodology. Can you describe for the court how Mr. Henderson first approached you about making accusations against your sister? Prosecutor Martinez asked, guiding Melody through testimony that would expose Craig's grooming techniques for the public record. He started by asking me to help him protect Tommy from what he called Dakota's concerning behavior. Melody replied, her voice breaking slightly as she recounted the beginning of her manipulation. He made me feel special and mature by suggesting that I was the only family member observant enough to recognize subtle signs of abuse that adults might miss. The detailed testimony that followed revealed Craig's systematic corruption of Melody's perception and judgment, demonstrating how he had exploited her natural love for Tommy while gradually teaching her to interpret innocent interactions as evidence of criminal behavior. Her account provided crucial insight into how organized predators used family relationships as weapons against their victims. He gave me educational materials about child abuse and coached me on what specific details would be most convincing to investigators. Melody continued looking directly at Craig as she described his betrayal of her trust and innocence. He taught me to write diary entries that documented abuse that never happened, always emphasizing that my testimony was Tommy's only protection from further harm. Craig's defense team attempted to discredit Melody's testimony by suggesting that her recantation was motivated by guilt and family pressure rather than genuine recognition of her manipulation. But federal investigators had documented extensive evidence of his grooming techniques that corroborated every element of her account. The defendant's manipulation of this witness represents a textbook example of the coercive control techniques used by organized criminal networks to create false testimony while protecting their own operations. Prosecutor Martinez argued in her closing statement, Melody Henderson was as much a victim of this defendant as her siblings weaponized against her own family through systematic psychological abuse. Craig's conviction on all federal charges was followed by his sentencing to 25 years in federal prison, with additional state charges pending in Ohio and Illinois, where his previous victims had been located, through the ongoing investigation. His network of corrupt allies within local law enforcement and child services received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years for their roles in suppressing evidence and manipulating investigations. Melody's decision to become an advocate for victims of false accusations and judicial corruption emerged from her recognition that Craig's techniques were being used by other predators to destroy innocent families while protecting their own criminal activities. Her unique perspective as someone who had been manipulated into providing false testimony made her an invaluable resource for identifying and exposing similar cases. I understand how false accusations can seem convincing, because I lived inside the mind of someone who believed lies that felt completely real. Melody explained during her first public speaking engagement at a conference for legal professionals. But I also understand how victims of manipulation can be held accountable for their actions while still receiving the support they need to heal from their own trauma. The nonprofit organization that Melody founded, Truth and Reconciliation for Families, became a national resource for identifying cases where false accusations might be the result of systematic manipulation rather than genuine witness testimony. Her work helped expose 12 other cases where organized predators had used similar techniques to frame innocent family members while protecting their own criminal activities. Melody's advocacy has been instrumental in developing new protocols for investigating family abuse cases, explained Dr. Patricia Evans, the pediatrician, whose suppressed reports had provided crucial evidence of Craig's crimes. Her insights into manipulation techniques have helped train investigators to recognize when witness testimony might be the result of coercion rather than genuine observation. The speaking engagements that Melody undertook across the country required her to repeatedly relive the trauma of her manipulation while publicly acknowledging her role in my persecution, a form of accountability that was both personally painful and professionally valuable for audiences seeking to understand the psychology of false accusations. I have to live with the knowledge that my lies nearly sent my innocent sister to prison, while the real predator continued abusing our baby brother. Melody told audiences of prosecutors, social workers, and law enforcement officials, but I also have to use that knowledge to prevent other families from experiencing the destruction that Craig orchestrated against us. The therapeutic work that Melody required to process her own trauma while maintaining the emotional stability necessary for public advocacy was extensive and ongoing. Dr. Rebecca Thompson continued working with her to address the complex guilt and shame associated with having been used as a weapon against her own family. Melody's healing requires her to accept responsibility for her actions, while understanding that those actions were the result of sophisticated manipulation designed to exploit her love for her family. Dr. Thompson explained during a consultation about Melody's advocacy work. Her willingness to transform her trauma into a tool for protecting other families represents a form of redemption that benefits everyone involved. The recognition that Melody received for her advocacy work included invitations to testify before congressional committees investigating corruption within local law enforcement and child protective services agencies. Her testimony helped shape federal legislation designed to prevent the kind of systematic manipulation that had nearly destroyed our family. Melody Henderson's transformation from victim of coercive control to advocate for judicial reform represents one of the most remarkable examples of personal redemption I've encountered in 30 years of legal practice, announced federal judge Sarah Williams during a ceremony honoring victims' advocates. Her courage in publicly acknowledging her manipulation while working to prevent similar tragedies demonstrates the highest ideals of restorative justice. The relationship between Melody and me required careful rebuilding, based on mutual understanding of each other's trauma and shared commitment to preventing similar manipulation of other families. Our work together on cases involving false accusations provided a foundation for healing that was both personally meaningful and professionally valuable. Dakota and I have learned to see each other as survivors of the same predator rather than perpetrator and victim. Melody explained during a joint interview about our advocacy work. Craig's manipulation was designed to turn us against each other, but understanding his techniques has allowed us to rebuild our relationship based on truth and mutual support. The documentary film that was produced about our family's experience with systematic manipulation became a training tool for law enforcement agencies across the country, providing real-world examples of how organized predators used false accusations to protect their criminal operations while destroying innocent lives. Our story isn't unique, Melody emphasized during the film's premiere. Craig's network was using these techniques against multiple families, and there are probably other networks operating right now that we haven't discovered yet. The only way to protect vulnerable families is to educate investigators about how these manipulation schemes actually work. The scholarship fund that Melody established for young people interested in careers in criminal justice and victim advocacy provided resources for students who wanted to develop expertise in recognizing and combating systematic manipulation within legal and social service systems. I can't undo the harm that my false testimony caused to Dakota and Tommy, Melody reflected during the Scholarship Fund's inaugural ceremony. But I can help prepare the next generation of professionals to recognize and resist the kind of manipulation that nearly destroyed our family. 5 years after Craig's conviction, Melody had become a nationally recognized expert on coercive control techniques and false accusation cases, with her advocacy work credited with helping to expose corruption and protect vulnerable families across the country. Her transformation from manipulated teenager to powerful voice for justice represented both personal redemption and professional achievement. Melody's work has helped prevent countless families from experiencing the devastation that we endured, I said during a ceremony marking the 5th anniversary of our vindication. Her willingness to transform her trauma into a tool for protecting others represents the best possible outcome from the worst possible circumstances. The healing between Melody and me was complete, not because we had forgotten the pain of Craig's manipulation, but because we had learned to use our shared experience to protect other families from similar destruction. Her redemption was real, earned through years of hard work and unwavering commitment to truth and justice. The scholarship letter from Indiana University arrived on a crisp October morning, 5 years after my vindication, and exactly 6 years since Craig's false accusations had first shattered my life. The full academic scholarship for their graduate program in social work represented not just educational opportunity, but validation that my traumatic experiences could be transformed into tools for protecting other vulnerable families. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," Linda said as we sat at our kitchen table reading the scholarship details together. You've taken the worst thing that ever happened to our family and turned it into something that will help countless other people." The decision to pursue social work as a career had emerged naturally from my experiences navigating the child welfare system that had failed me so completely. I had witnessed firsthand how institutional corruption and professional incompetence could destroy innocent lives, but I had also seen how dedicated advocates like Jessica Martinez could make the difference between justice and injustice. I want to work specifically with cases involving false accusations and systematic manipulation. I explained to Dr. Thompson during one of my final therapy sessions before starting graduate school. My experience gives me insights into how these cases develop that most social workers never acquire. The specialized focus on false accusation cases was practically unique within social work education, as most programs concentrated on identifying genuine abuse rather than recognizing sophisticated manipulation techniques designed to create false evidence. My professors at Indiana University were eager to incorporate my real-world experience into their curriculum. Professor Janet Morrison, who directed the university's child welfare specialization program, had been following my case since the federal investigation exposed Craig's network. She saw my enrollment as an opportunity to develop new approaches to training social workers in recognizing and combating systematic manipulation within family systems. Dakota's experience represents a case study that every child welfare professional should understand, Professor Morrison explained during my admission interview. The techniques used against her family are being employed by predators across the country, and we need practitioners who can recognize and respond to these sophisticated manipulation schemes. The research project that became my master's thesis focused on developing screening protocols that could help social workers identify cases where witness testimony might be the result of coercive control rather than genuine observation. Working with data from federal investigations into organized abuse networks, I was able to identify specific patterns that distinguished manipulated testimony from authentic victim accounts. The most significant finding in Dakota's research is that certain linguistic and behavioral patterns in witness testimony can indicate systematic coaching by perpetrators, explained Dr. Patricia Evans, who served on my thesis committee. This work has the potential to prevent wrongful prosecutions while improving protection for genuine victims. The internship placement that I secured with the Marion County Department of Child Services was initially controversial given my history with that agency during my own case. However, Director Michelle Rodriguez recognized that my experience provided unique qualifications for identifying institutional failures and developing improved practices. Dakota Henderson understands this system from the perspective of someone who was failed by it. Director Rodriguez announced during a staff meeting introducing my internship, her insights will help us identify blind spots in our procedures that might allow other families to experience similar injustices. The first case assigned to me during my internship involved a 13-year-old girl whose stepfather was suspected of abuse based on her testimony. But something about the allegations reminded me of the coach testimony that Melody had provided against me. The linguistic patterns and specific details in the girl's statements suggested possible manipulation rather than genuine observation. I need to investigate this case more carefully, I told my supervisor, explaining the similarities I had observed between this situation and my own family's experience with systematic manipulation. The testimony shows signs of coaching that might indicate the stepfather is being framed by the actual perpetrator. The investigation that followed revealed that the girl's biological father, who was seeking custody during a contentious divorce, had been systematically coaching her to make false allegations against her stepfather while concealing his own inappropriate behavior. The case became a model for how trained practitioners could identify and expose manipulation techniques that were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Dakota's ability to recognize false testimony saved that family from the same destruction that her own family experienced, noted Professor Morrison in a case study that became part of the university's training curriculum. Her unique perspective allowed her to see patterns that other social workers might have missed. The job offer from the Indiana Department of Child Services came with an unusual specialty designation that reflected my unique qualifications and the growing recognition that false accusations represented a significant threat to family integrity. I would be working specifically with cases involving possible systematic manipulation and false testimony. We've created this position specifically to address the gap in our system that allowed Dakota's persecution to continue for so long, explained State Director Jennifer Walsh during my job interview. Your experience and education make you uniquely qualified to identify cases where our traditional investigative approaches might be inadequate. The reunification work that I began with Tommy, now 8 years old and thriving in therapy, provided the most personally meaningful aspect of my new career. His recovery from Craig's abuse had been remarkable, aided by extensive therapy and the unconditional love of a family that had learned to protect each other from manipulation. Dakota's like my guardian angel, Tommy told his therapist during one of his sessions. She went through something really bad to make sure I would be safe, and now she helps other kids who need protection too. The relationship between Tommy and me had been completely rebuilt through years of patient therapeutic work and consistent demonstration that I was committed to his safety and well-being. He had no memory of the false accusations that had once separated us, knowing only that I was the big sister who fought for his protection when other adults had failed him. The nonprofit organization that Melody and I founded together, Families Against False Accusations, became a national resource for legal professionals, social workers, and families dealing with systematic manipulation and coached testimony. Our combined perspectives as both victim and manipulated witness provided comprehensive insight into how these cases developed and could be resolved. Our organization serves families on both sides of false accusation cases. I explained during a conference presentation about our work. We help genuine victims access resources while also supporting innocent people who have been framed by sophisticated predators. The federal legislation that emerged partially from our advocacy work established new protocols for investigating family abuse cases, requiring additional scrutiny when witness testimony showed signs of potential manipulation or coaching. The Henderson Act, named after our family's experience, provided funding for specialized training programs designed to help professionals recognize systematic manipulation. Dakota and Melody Henderson's advocacy has fundamentally changed how we approach family abuse investigations, announced Senator Patricia Williams during the bill signing ceremony. Their courage in transforming personal trauma into public protection will prevent countless other families from experiencing similar injustices. The speaking engagements that I began accepting across the country provided opportunities to share the insights gained from my experience while advocating for reforms that could prevent similar cases. Each presentation required reliving painful memories, but the knowledge that my suffering could protect other families made the emotional cost worthwhile. I'm not here to discourage investigation of child abuse, I emphasized during a presentation to the National Association of Social Workers. I'm here to help you recognize when investigations might be manipulated by the actual perpetrators to deflect attention from their own crimes. The doctoral program in criminology that I plan to pursue would focus specifically on organized networks of predators and their use of institutional corruption to protect their criminal activities. My research would build on the federal investigations that had exposed Craig's network while exploring how similar operations might be identified and disrupted. Dakota's academic work represents the cutting edge of understanding how organized criminal networks exploit family and institutional relationships, explained Dr. Michael Rodriguez, who agreed to serve as my doctoral advisor. Her research will help law enforcement agencies identify and combat these sophisticated criminal enterprises. The family that we had rebuilt was stronger than anything we had before Craig's manipulation nearly destroyed us. We had learned to communicate honestly, recognize manipulation, and protect each other from people who would exploit our love as a weapon against us. Our shared trauma had become the foundation for unbreakable bonds based on truth and mutual support. We're not the same family we were before, Linda reflected during our weekly family dinner, a tradition we had established to maintain connection and communication. We're something completely new, built on understanding and commitment, rather than assumption and blind trust. The vindication that I had achieved was complete, but more importantly, it had been transformed into a tool for protecting other families from similar destruction. My education experience and unique perspective had positioned me to make a difference in the world that extended far beyond my personal healing. I used to think that survival was enough. I told a group of social work students during a guest lecture about institutional corruption, but I've learned that transformation is what makes survival meaningful. Our trauma can become a gift that we give to others who need protection from the same threats we survived. The new beginning that I had built from the ashes of Craig's destruction was based on truth, justice, and service to vulnerable families who needed advocates capable of recognizing and combating sophisticated manipulation. My life had found its purpose in the same system that had once nearly destroyed it. 10 years have passed since that devastating Tuesday evening when Melody's 4 words changed the trajectory of our entire family's life. As I sit in my office at the Indiana University School of Social Work, where I now serve as an assistant professor specializing in false accusations and systematic manipulation, I often reflect on the extraordinary journey that brought me from a detention cell to a position where I can protect other families from the destruction that nearly consumed us. The program that I developed for training child welfare professionals has been implemented in 37 states, providing social workers and investigators with the tools necessary to recognize sophisticated manipulation techniques employed by organized predators. The research that grew from my master's thesis has become the foundation for new federal protocols that have prevented an estimated 200 wrongful prosecutions, while improving protection for genuine abuse victims. Tommy, now 14 years old and thriving as a high school freshman, recently asked me to speak to his peer counseling group about overcoming trauma and finding purpose through adversity. His recovery from Craig's abuse has been so complete that he has become an advocate for other young survivors, demonstrating the resilience of the human spirit when surrounded by genuine love and protection. My sister taught me that surviving something terrible isn't the end of the story, Tommy told his classmates during my presentation. It can be the beginning of something amazing if you're willing to use your experience to help other people who need protection. The relationship between Tommy and me represents perhaps the greatest victory over Craig's manipulation. The little boy who once cringed when I entered his hospital room now considers me his closest confidant and strongest advocate. Our bond has been forged through shared understanding of trauma and mutual commitment to preventing other families from experiencing similar destruction. Melody's organization, Truth and Reconciliation for Families, has expanded into a national network that provides resources for families dealing with false accusations while supporting genuine victims of abuse. Her transformation from manipulated teenager to powerful advocate represents the possibility of redemption, even after the most devastating betrayals. Dakota and I learned that healing isn't about forgetting what happened, Melody explained during our joint keynote address at the National Conference on Child Protection. It's about using what happened to create something better for other people who need protection from the same threats we survived. The collaboration between Melody and me has produced training materials that are used internationally to help professionals distinguish between genuine victim testimony and coached accusations designed to protect actual perpetrators. Our combined perspectives provide comprehensive insight into how systematic manipulation develops and can be exposed before innocent lives are destroyed. Linda has become a volunteer advocate for single mothers who find themselves targeted by predators seeking vulnerable families to exploit. Her experience with Craig's psychological manipulation has given her unique abilities to recognize and resist coercive control techniques while helping other women protect their children from similar threats. I've learned to trust my instincts again, Linda shared during a support group meeting for families affected by systematic manipulation. But more importantly, I've learned to teach my children to trust their own instincts and to never let anyone override their judgment about their own safety and well-being. The family therapy that we underwent for 3 years provided us with communication skills and protective strategies that have made our relationship stronger than they ever were before Craig's manipulation. We've learned to address conflicts, directly question information that seems suspicious, and maintain connections with extended family and community members who can provide independent perspectives on our dynamics. Jessica Martinez, the social worker whose courage in challenging my prosecution helped expose Craig's crimes, has become a close family friend and professional colleague. Her dedication to justice despite institutional pressure demonstrated the difference that individual advocates can make when they're willing to challenge corruption and fight for truth. Dakota's case taught me that our greatest professional responsibility is to question official narratives when they don't align with the evidence. Jessica reflected during a ceremony honoring her contributions to child welfare reform. Sometimes protecting children means challenging the very system that's supposed to serve their interests. The federal legislation that emerged from our advocacy efforts has created specialized courts for handling complex family abuse cases where systematic manipulation might be present. These courts are staffed by judges and attorneys trained to recognize coercive control techniques while ensuring that genuine victims receive appropriate protection. The Henderson Act represents the most significant advancement in family justice legislation in the past century, announced federal Judge Sarah Williams during the law's 5th anniversary celebration. The specialized protocols it established have prevented countless wrongful prosecutions while improving outcomes for authentic abuse victims. Craig Henderson died in federal prison 7 years into his sentence, killed by another inmate who had learned about his crimes against children. His death provided a sense of closure for our family while eliminating any possibility that he might eventually be released to harm other children. The network of corrupt officials who had protected Craig's operations received various sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years in federal prison. Their conviction sent a powerful message to other potential conspirators that systematic corruption of child welfare systems would result in severe consequences rather than professional advancement. Patricia, my aunt whose professional surveillance had provided the evidence necessary to expose Craig's crimes, became the director of a federal task force investigating organized networks of child predators. Her expertise in recognizing and documenting systematic manipulation has been instrumental in dismantling similar operations across the country. Dakota's case provided the template that we now use to identify and prosecute organized abuse networks. Patricia explained during a congressional hearing about federal child protection efforts. The techniques that nearly destroyed her family are being used by predators nationwide, and our understanding of those techniques has become our most powerful weapon against them. The scholarship program that I established for students interested in careers combating systematic manipulation has provided funding for over 200 young people pursuing education in social work, criminal justice, and victim advocacy. These scholars represent the next generation of professionals who will continue the fight against institutional corruption and organized predatory behavior. The book that I published about our family's experience, titled The Truth Beneath the Lies, A Family's Journey Through False Accusations to Justice, became required reading in social work and criminal justice programs across the country. The royalties from the book fund additional research into manipulation techniques and provide resources for families dealing with similar crises. Dakota Henderson's memoir provides essential insights into how organized predators use institutional relationships to destroy innocent families while protecting their own criminal activities, wrote Dr. Patricia Evans in her review for the Journal of Child Welfare. This book should be required reading for every professional working in family services. The research center that I now direct at Indiana University focuses specifically on developing new methods for identifying and combating systematic manipulation within family and institutional settings. Our work combines psychological research with criminological investigation to understand how organized predators exploit relationship dynamics while corrupting protective systems. As I prepare for another day of teaching students who will become the next generation of child welfare professionals, I'm reminded of the extraordinary path that brought me from false accusations to professional fulfillment. The nightmare that began with Melody's coach testimony has been transformed into a career dedicated to ensuring that other innocent families receive the protection and justice that we nearly lost. The truth that finally emerged from months of careful investigation has become the foundation for systemic reforms that protect vulnerable families while exposing institutional corruption. My vindication was complete, but more importantly, it has been used to create lasting change that extends far beyond my personal healing. Tommy bounds into my office as I finish preparing my lecture notes, his face bright with the confidence of a young man who knows he's protected and loved. "Are you ready for tonight's family dinner?" he asks, referring to our weekly tradition of gathering to share experiences and maintain the open communication that prevents manipulation from taking root in our relationships. "I absolutely," I reply, gathering my materials while reflecting on how extraordinary it is that Craig's attempt to destroy our family has ultimately made us stronger, closer, and more committed to protecting each other than we ever were before his manipulation entered our lives. The room that once fell silent with Melody's devastating accusations now fills regularly with laughter, honest conversation, and the kind of genuine love that can survive even the most sophisticated attempts at destruction. We've learned that truth, while sometimes painful to uncover, provides the only foundation for lasting healing and authentic relationships. As we prepare for another evening of family connection built on the lessons learned from our shared trauma, I'm reminded that the worst experiences in our lives can become the sources of our greatest strength when we're willing to transform suffering into service and pain into protection for others who face similar threats. The journey from false accusations to family healing to professional purpose has taught me that redemption is always possible. Justice sometimes prevails, and love, when founded on truth rather than illusion, can survive and flourish despite the most determined attempts to destroy it. I invite you to share your thoughts about this story in the comments below. Have you or someone you know ever experienced systematic manipulation that turned family members against each other? How do you think we can better protect vulnerable families from predators who use false accusations to cover their own crimes? Please like this video if Dakota's story moved you, subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and justice, and share this with others who might benefit from understanding how truth can ultimately prevail, even in the darkest circumstances. Thank you for joining me on this journey of healing and hope. Remember, that no matter how dark your situation might seem, there are always people working to expose the truth and protect the innocent. Never give up on justice and never stop fighting for the people you love.